Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bleak Fears. Tonight, I'm sharing 11 deeply disturbing, true small-town horror stories from Arizona that will make you question every quiet desert community you've ever passed through. These are not fabricated tales, but genuine experiences from individuals who encountered something profoundly terrifying in places most consider too peaceful for darkness to take root. Each account has been collected from direct sources who survived these unsettling events and chose to break their silence so others might understand what can hide beneath the surface of America's forgotten towns. The small communities we assume are safe and uneventful can conceal horrors we never imagine, from ancient forces that refuse to rest to nightmares that emerge from isolation itself. If you value authentic horror narratives grounded in truth, subscribe to Bleak Fears and enable the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into the most unnerving real-world encounters. Once you've heard these chilling testimonies, leave your own disturbing small-town experiences in the comments section. We're building a space where people can reveal the terrors that exist beyond common awareness. Now steel yourself as we delve into 11 incidents that turned ordinary Arizona towns into landscapes of inescapable dread. I still have nightmares about those tapes, not because of what I saw on them, but because of what they showed me about reality itself. My name is Julian, and back in October 2019, I was 28 years old and thought I had my whole career figured out. I was a documentary filmmaker, one of those pretentious types who insisted on shooting everything on analog equipment because it gave the footage soul, or whatever bullshit I told myself back then. I'd driven down to Bisbee, Arizona, chasing a project about abandoned mining operations. The town itself is this weird little artistic community built into the mountains, full of galleries and coffee shops now, but it used to be one of the biggest copper mining towns in the world. The Lavender Pit especially fascinated me. This massive open pit mine that looks like a wound in the earth, terraced and colorful, abandoned since the early 70s. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the light was perfect, that golden hour photographers live for. The temperature was dropping as the sun started its descent toward the mountains, and I had maybe an hour of good filming time left. I set up my camera, this beautiful old Bolex I'd inherited from my grandfather, loaded with fresh film stock. The weight of it felt good in my hands, substantial, real in a way digital cameras never managed. I spent about 45 minutes establishing shots of the pit, the way the shadows fell across those terraced levels, the strange colors in the exposed rock layers. Copper oxide stains everything down there, greens and blues and rust reds that don't look like they belong on Earth. I was completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. No crew, no distractions, just me and the landscape and the steady whir of the camera mechanism. After I finished shooting, I packed up and drove back to my motel in Old Bisbee, this renovated place that used to be a boarding house for miners. My room was small but clean, with thick walls that kept out most of the noise from the street below. I set up my portable editing station on the desk, pulled out my laptop and the small monitor I traveled with. The routine was always the same: shoot during the day, review footage at night, make notes for the next day's filming. I loaded the first tape into my player and hit rewind, listening to that mechanical sound that always made me feel like a real filmmaker instead of just another guy with a camera. The tape finished rewinding and I started playback. The footage looked good, exactly what I'd expected. The late afternoon light painting everything in warm tones, the pit stretching out dramatically, my slow pan across the terraced levels. I was making mental notes about which shots to keep when something changed on the screen. The time code jumped forward 3 minutes, but I hadn't touched anything. Suddenly, I was looking at the same location, the same angle, but everything was different. The footage showed complete darkness, like someone had filmed at midnight with no lights, and there, standing exactly where my camera had been positioned, was a figure. I stopped breathing for a moment. The figure was just a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, but it was definitely human-shaped, definitely holding something at chest level. A camera. Someone was filming back toward where I'd been standing. The footage was grainy, degraded in a way that analog film shouldn't be after just a few hours. I could hear something on the audio track too, underneath the usual tape hiss, a mechanical whirring that sounded exactly like my Bolex. I rewound the tape and watched it again. The 3 minutes of footage I hadn't shot were still there. Same figure, same impossible darkness, same wrong feeling crawling up my spine. I checked the timecode stamp. According to the numbers burned into the frame, this footage had been recorded tomorrow at the exact same time I planned to return to the pit for more shots. My hands started shaking. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the tape was defective. Maybe I'd accidentally filmed something earlier and forgotten. Maybe the timecode mechanism was broken. But I knew none of those explanations made sense. I remembered every second of that shoot. The tape had been fresh from the package, and the time code on my camera was synced to my phone, which was synced to the atomic clock. It didn't make mistakes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the desk rewatching that 3-minute segment over and over until my eyes burned and the sky outside started lightening. The figure never moved in the footage. It just stood there, camera pointed at me, or at where I would be, or had been, or whatever the hell was happening. When dawn finally came, I seriously considered packing up and leaving Bisbee, forgetting the whole project. But I'd already spent money I didn't have on this trip, and my producer was expecting a cut of footage by the end of the month. I needed this project to work. So I went back to the Lavender Pit that afternoon, arriving at the same time as the day before. I told myself I'd just shoot some quick footage and leave. Maybe the whole thing had been exhaustion, stress, too much coffee, and not enough sleep. I set up in a different location this time, maybe 50 yards from where I'd filmed yesterday. The afternoon was cooler, clouds moving in from the west, but the light was still good enough. I started filming, forcing myself to focus on the work, on the composition, on anything except that impossible footage. I shot for maybe 30 minutes before I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up fast, hands fumbling with the latches on my equipment case, and drove back to the motel. The dread in my stomach felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. I knew what I was going to find when I reviewed the tape, but I had to look anyway. I had to know. The footage I'd shot that afternoon looked normal at first. Different angle, differenter lighting, but clean shots of the pit that would work fine in the final documentary. Then the time code jumped. 5 minutes this time. The scene changed to the same night vision darkness, but now there were 2 figures. One standing where I'd filmed today, another standing where I'd filmed yesterday, both holding cameras, both pointed at me, both filming. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. My whole body was shaking, cold sweat running down my back despite the warm evening. When I came back to the desk, the footage was still playing. I watched those 2 figures stand motionless in the darkness for 5 full minutes before the tape cut back to my normal footage. The audio was worse this time. Underneath the mechanical whirring of 2 cameras, I could hear something else. Breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing that didn't match any rhythm a human should have. That's when I noticed something that made everything so much worse. I could see details on the figures now that I'd missed before. The one in my original position from yesterday was wearing jeans and a dark blue jacket. The one from today's position wore jeans and a green flannel shirt. I looked down at what I was wearing. Green flannel shirt. I looked at the jacket hanging on the back of the chair. Dark blue, the one I'd worn yesterday. The figures in the impossible footage were me. I spent the next 2 days locked in that motel room, reviewing every tape I'd shot in Bisbee. Every single one contained footage I hadn't recorded. The mystery segments got longer with each tape. 3 minutes, then 5, then 8. The number of figures increased too. By the 4th tape, there were 6 of me standing in the darkness, all holding cameras, all pointed at the same spot. The breathing on the audio track had multiplied into a chorus, this horrible synchronized rhythm that didn't sound human anymore despite coming from what looked like human figures. I tried to make sense of it. I drew diagrams, made lists, wrote out theories that dissolved into nonsense the moment I looked at them. Was I filming myself in the future? Was something else filming me? Were these different versions of me from different timelines? Every explanation was impossible, and the footage just kept coming. On the 5th day, I loaded a tape from the morning's shoot. I hadn't even gone to the pit that day. I'd just filmed some establishing shots of the town itself, trying to salvage something usable from this disaster of a trip. The tape showed me 9 figures now, arranged in a circle around the lavender pit. The time code said it was recorded 3 days from now at 2 in the morning. I could see more details in this footage, like whatever was recording had better light sensitivity than my camera should have. The figures' faces were visible, and they were all mine, but wrong. The expressions were blank, empty, like someone had hollowed out everything that made those faces human, and left just the mask behind. And they were all filming, toward the center of the circle, toward a spot where nothing stood, except something did stand there. I had to pause the tape and increase the brightness on my monitor to see it, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. In the center of the circle of cameras, there was a shape. It looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong, like someone had described a person to an alien, and the alien had tried to build one from memory. The thing's head was tilted at an angle that should have broken its neck, and even in the degraded footage, I could tell it was looking directly at the camera. Looking at me, watching myself watch it. I made a decision then that probably saved my life, or at least my sanity. I grabbed every tape I'd shot in Bisbee, all 15 of them, and I ran outside to the parking lot. There was a dumpster behind the motel, the kind with the heavy metal lid. I threw the tapes in and walked back to my room, but I couldn't leave it at that. The thought of those tapes existing, of someone finding them, of whatever was on them spreading somehow, I couldn't handle it. I went back out with a can of lighter fluid I'd bought for my camp stove and emptied it over the tapes. I lit a match and dropped it in. The tapes burned with this acrid chemical smell, black smoke rising into the desert sky. I watched until they were nothing but melted plastic and twisted metal, and even then I wasn't sure it was enough, because I still had my camera. The Bolex was sitting in my room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was contaminated somehow, that whatever had put that footage on my tapes had come through the camera itself. I went back inside and found the camera sitting on the desk where I'd left it. It looked normal, just an old mechanical camera, beautiful and harmless. But when I picked it up, it was warm. Not hot, just body temperature, like something alive had been holding it. The hair on my arm stood up. I opened the film compartment and found it loaded with the tape I didn't remember putting in. The tape case was labeled in handwriting that looked almost like mine, but not quite. It said, "Don't watch this one." My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the camera. I pulled the tape out and held it up to the light. Through the clear plastic casing, I could see the film inside, wound tight on its reel. For just a second, I thought I saw something on the film itself, an image printed directly onto the celluloid. A figure, a camera, a circle of me standing in the dark. I put the tape in my pocket and grabbed my laptop. I needed to leave, needed to get out of Bisbee and never come back. I packed everything in under 10 minutes, throwing clothes and equipment into bags without caring about organization. The whole time I could feel the tape in my pocket like it was burning a hole through the fabric. When I carried my bags out to the car, the sun was setting again, that same golden light that had seemed so perfect just days ago. Now it felt wrong, like the world was tilting into darkness too fast. I threw everything in the trunk and got behind the wheel. That's when I made my final mistake. I pulled the tape out of my pocket, thinking, maybe I should destroy this one too, burn it with the others. But I looked at it again, really looked at it, and I noticed something. The label wasn't in handwriting that looked like mine. It was my handwriting, exactly my handwriting, including a little flourish on the capital D that I'd developed in college. I'd written that label, but I had no memory of doing it. I started the car and pointed it toward the highway. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing in front of my motel room, perfectly still, was a figure. I couldn't make out details in the growing darkness, but I knew it was holding something at chest level. A camera, pointed at my car, at me. I drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop until I hit Phoenix. By then it was past midnight, and I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. I checked into a chain motel off the interstate and collapsed on the bed, still fully clothed. That's when I noticed the red light. My camera bag had fallen open, and inside my Bolex was running. The mechanism was whirring softly, that familiar sound that used to comfort me. But I hadn't turned it on, and according to the frame counter, it had been recording since I left Bisbee. I picked up the camera, and the viewfinder was pressed against something in the bag, just showing darkness. But when I pulled it out and looked through it, I saw my motel room. I saw the bed. I saw myself lying on it, passed out. And I saw something else, something standing in the corner by the bathroom, something that couldn't possibly fit in the frame because the corner was maybe 7 feet from floor to ceiling, and this thing was taller than that, folded over on itself to fit in the space. I dropped the camera and it hit the floor hard enough to crack the housing. The recording stopped. The whirring died away. I stood there in that generic motel room, breathing hard, and I knew I had a choice. I could look in that corner. I could see if something was really there, or if I'd finally lost my mind completely. Or I could leave the camera where it fell, walk out of that room, and never look back. I chose the third option. I walked to the corner and looked. Nothing was there, just ugly wallpaper and a water stain on the ceiling. I laughed, this shaky, hysterical sound, and bent down to pick up the camera. That's when I saw my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I was standing in the corner, camera pointed at myself on the bed. My expression was blank, empty, like someone had hollowed me out and left just... The sound of my phone ringing snapped me back. It was my producer, wondering where the hell my footage was. I told him the project fell through, that I'd lost all the tapes in a freak accident. He was furious, said I'd never work in documentary, filmmaking again. I said okay and hung up. Then I took the battery out of my phone, smashed the SIM card, and threw everything in the trash. That was 5 years ago. I don't make films anymore. I don't even own a camera. Sometimes I see myself in mirrors or windows, and I have to look away fast before I notice if my reflection is doing exactly what I'm doing, or if it's standing just a little too still, holding something at chest level, filming me from the other side of the glass. The tape is still in my pocket. I've carried it every day since Bisbee, and I've never watched it. The label has started to fade, but I can still read it. Don't watch this one. Good advice. But someday I know I'm going to watch it anyway, and when I do, I think I'll finally understand what was filming me in the darkness. What's still filming me? What's been filming me this whole time, recording every moment, every choice, every... The camera in my closet just started whirring. I threw it away 3 years ago, but I can hear it right now, that mechanical sound carrying through my apartment. And my reflection in the black screen of my television is holding something. I can't see what it is in the darkness, but I know, I've always known, it's still recording. People always ask me why I still work the ranch after what happened. Truth is, I don't have a choice anymore. My name is Trace, and back in June 2003, I was 45 years old and thought I'd seen everything there was to see working cattle in southern Arizona. I'd been a ranch hand for over 20 years at the Double R Ranch just outside Patagonia, right off Highway 82 where the grasslands meet the mountains. The work was hard but honest, and I liked the isolation, liked being away from people and their complications. But that summer taught me that isolation cuts both ways, and sometimes what finds you in the empty places is worse than anything human. It started with the cattle. We ran about 200 head, across 1,500 acres of high desert grassland, and I knew every animal by sight. In late May, I found the first one dead in the east pasture. A young steer, maybe 800 pounds, lying on its side in a circle of disturbed earth. When I got closer, my stomach turned. The animal had been opened up with surgical precision. Heart, liver, and both kidneys were gone, removed so cleanly there was barely any blood on the ground. The edges of the incisions looked cauterized, like someone had used a laser or extreme heat. But what really got me was the smell. Dead cattle smell. Bad. Everyone knows that, but this was different. Sweet, almost floral, completely wrong for decay. I called the owner, told him we had a situation. He drove out from Tucson that afternoon and stood over the carcass for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said to bury it deep and not mention it to anyone. Cattle mutilations were bad for business, attracted the wrong kind of attention from UFO types and conspiracy theorists. I did what he asked, but 3 days later, I found 2 more. Same precise removal of organs, same strange sweet smell, same circle of disturbed earth around each body. This time they were arranged, positioned exactly 30 feet apart in a perfect line pointing northeast. The vultures wouldn't touch them. That's what scared me most. Vultures will eat anything dead, but they circled high overhead and never came down. Even the coyotes stayed away. And I'd seen coyotes eat through barbed wire to get at a carcass. Something about those dead cattle was fundamentally wrong in a way that even scavengers could sense. After the second incident, I started sleeping in the barn to keep watch. The owner didn't ask me to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was doing this would come back. On the 4th night, around 3 in the morning, every cow in the nearby pasture started making noise at once. Not the usual lowing or distressed calls, but the synchronized sound that raised the hair on my neck. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and went out to check. The cattle were all standing at the fence line, facing north, completely still except for their mouths moving. The synchronized sound was coming from all of them at once, and as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a natural cattle sound at all. It was words. Broken, guttural, but definitely human words coming from 200 animal throats, trying to form syllables they weren't built for. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the cadence was like a chant or prayer in a language I'd never heard. I ran back to the barn and locked myself inside, rifle across my lap, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, the cattle were grazing normally like nothing had happened. I told myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion and stress had made me hallucinate. But I knew better. I'd heard what I'd heard. That afternoon, while fixing fence in the north pasture, I found the journal. It was wrapped in oilcloth and buried in a metal box under a pile of rocks near an old line shack. The journal belonged to the owner's grandfather, dated 1934, and the first entry I read made my blood run cold. He described the same cattle mutilations, the same sweet smell, the same refusal of scavengers to approach. He wrote about seeing a figure on the distant hills at dawn, impossibly tall and thin, moving among shapes he first thought were sheep, but realized were wrong. Too upright, too human in their movements. The journal detailed a bargain the grandfather had made. Something called El Pastor, the shepherd, appeared in this area every 23 years. It needed to be acknowledged, to be given its due, or it would take what it wanted. The grandfather had performed a ritual, offered specific items at specific locations, and El Pastor had left the ranch alone. The journal included dates, instructions, warnings. The next appearance year was listed, 2003, this year, and according to the grandfather's calculations, El Pastor would arrive in early June. It was already June 15th. I took the journal back to the house and spent the evening reading every page. The grandfather wrote about local Mexican families who'd known about El Pastor for generations, who performed their own rituals to keep it satisfied. He described what happened to those who ignored it or failed to complete the tending properly. Entire families gone. Livestock found arranged in symbols that hurt to look at. People who came back wrong, their eyes empty, speaking in that same broken multitude voice. The next morning, I drove into Patagonia and asked around about El Pastor. Most people shut down the conversation immediately, but an old woman at the grocery store pulled me aside. She asked if I'd seen him yet. When I said no, she looked relieved and told me I still had time. She gave me an address, told me to visit her grandson, who knew the old ways. I found him living in a small house near the creek. His name was irrelevant because he made it clear he wouldn't help. He said the Anglo ranchers had ignored the warnings for too long, that El Pastor was patient, but not forgiving. The only thing he'd tell me was to watch the hills at dawn, and whatever I did, don't let it count me. I got back to the ranch as the sun was setting. The owner had returned from Tucson and was standing in the yard, looking at something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw it for the first time. On the hill, maybe 2 miles north, backlit by the dying sun, was a figure. Even at that distance, I could tell it was wrong. Too tall, too thin, proportions that didn't match any living thing I knew. It stood completely motionless, and around it were shapes that might have been animals, but stood too upright, moved too deliberately. The owner turned to me with eyes full of fear I'd never seen in him before. He said his grandfather had told him stories when he was young, but he'd thought they were just tales to scare children. He asked if I'd found anything that might help. I showed him the journal. We stayed up all night reading it together, making lists of what we'd need for the ritual. Some items were easy, things we had on the ranch. Others were specific, obscure, required trips to particular places the grandfather had marked on a hand-drawn map. Over the next week, we prepared. We gathered soil from 7 different locations around the ranch. We buried iron horseshoes at the cardinal points of the property. We left offerings of cornmeal and tobacco at the old line shack. The whole time, I kept seeing that figure on the hills, never in the same place twice, but always watching, and the shapes around it multiplied. By the end of the week, I counted 17 through binoculars, and they were definitely not sheep. Through the binoculars, I could see their faces. Human faces, but slack and empty, heads tilting at wrong angles. They moved in perfect synchronization with El Pastor, mirroring its movements exactly. I recognized one of them, a ranch hand who disappeared from a neighboring property 3 years ago. His family had searched for months, assumed he'd fallen in a canyon or been kicked by a horse. But there he was, standing on that hill, part of El Pastor's flock. The ritual had to be performed at midnight on the summer solstice. We followed the grandfather's instructions exactly, arranging the gathered items in a specific pattern in the east pasture where the first mutilated steer had been found. The journal said El Pastor would come to inspect the offering, to determine if the tending had been done properly. If it accepted, the ranch would be left alone for another 23 years. If it rejected the offering, or if we failed to complete the ritual, it would add us to its flock. Midnight came with a moon so bright I could see for miles. We stood at the edge of the ritual circle and waited. The temperature dropped fast, my breath fogging in air that had been 90 degrees an hour before. Then I heard it. Hoofbeats in the distance, but wrong. Too many legs, wrong rhythm, like dozens of animals moving as one entity. The sound got closer, and my hands started shaking. The owner grabbed my arm and whispered not to look directly at it, that the journal said direct eye contact was invitation. El Pastor emerged from the darkness at the north edge of the pasture. I kept my eyes down, but I could see its legs, if they were legs. Too many joints, bending in directions that violated basic anatomy. It moved through the ritual circle, and I heard sounds like pages turning, like it was reading what we'd laid out. The air smelled like that sweet wrongness from the mutilated cattle, so strong it made me dizzy. Then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the ground and sky and inside my own skull. It spoke names and dates in that same broken multitude voice I'd heard from the cattle. It went through a list, and I realized it was reciting everyone who'd lived on this ranch for the past century. When it reached my name, it paused. Then it said another date, 2026. The sound stopped. The cold vanished as suddenly as it had come. When I finally looked up, El Pastor was gone. The ritual items we'd arranged were gone too, leaving just bare earth in their pattern. The owner was on his knees, crying with relief. The tending had been accepted. We were safe for another cycle. But I heard my name. I heard my date. 2026 is coming fast now, and I know what it means. The next time El Pastor appears, I'm part of the bargain. I still work this ranch because leaving won't help. The old woman's grandson told me that once you're counted, once you're marked, distance doesn't matter. El Pastor tends its flock across all the miles between, and when your date comes, you go to the hills, whether you want to or not. I watch those northern hills every morning now. I see El Pastor sometimes, distant and patient, tending its shapes that used to be people. Sometimes I recognize more of them, folks who disappeared from Patagonia and the surrounding ranches over the years. They stand so still up there, waiting. I've started making my own preparations, writing my own journal, hoping maybe someone after me will find it and understand. The ritual works, but it only delays. El Pastor always gets its due eventually. 3 more years. That's what I have left. 3 more years before I join the flock on those hills, standing in perfect formation, moving when El Pastor moves, speaking when it speaks. I wonder if I'll know myself when it happens, or if whatever makes me who I am will be gone, replaced by that empty synchronization. I wonder if the others know, if somewhere inside those slack faces there's still a person screaming. The cattle know something's coming. They've started making that sound again at night, that broken multitude voice. Last week they were reciting dates, 2026 over and over. My year, my turn to be tended. Have you ever heard something that knows your name but shouldn't? Have you ever felt like you were being counted by something that measures time differently than we do? Tell me in the comments, because I need to know if El Pastor tends other places, or if Patagonia is unique in what it harbors in those hills. Technology was supposed to make sense. That's what I always believed. Circuits follow logic. Signals travel in predictable patterns. And every problem has a rational solution if you understand the system well enough. My name is Brock. I'm 32 years old, and I spent the last decade as a cell tower technician servicing communication infrastructure across northern Arizona. I've climbed hundreds of towers, diagnosed thousands of signal issues, and never encountered anything I couldn't explain with engineering principles and physics. That certainty died in March 2021 on a maintenance call outside Winslow that revealed something I still can't rationalize, no matter how many times I review the data. The COVID lockdowns were still affecting everything back then. Most of my service calls were solo operations. No apprentices or partners. Just me and my equipment driving across empty highways to fix problems remotely diagnosed by monitoring software. The call that changed everything came through on a Tuesday morning. A tower 17 miles southwest of Winslow was showing massive data transmission spikes, pushing bandwidth levels that shouldn't be physically possible given the equipment installed. The monitoring center flagged it as a hardware malfunction, probably damaged amplifiers, creating false readings. Standard maintenance, or so I thought. I loaded my truck with testing gear and made the 2-hour drive from Flagstaff. Highway 87 stretched out through open desert country, barely another vehicle in sight. The isolation felt normal by then, after a year of pandemic emptiness. The tower stood alone off a dirt access road, one of those older installations from the early 2000s. Steel lattice construction about 150 feet tall. Nothing remarkable about it visually, just another piece of infrastructure most people never notice. I ran my initial diagnostics from ground level, using a spectrum analyzer to check signal frequencies and a power meter to measure output. The readings were insane. The tower was transmitting data at rates 5 times higher than its rated capacity, pushing enough information to handle a small city's worth of traffic. But Winslow's population was barely 10,000, and most people weren't exactly streaming movies during a pandemic lockdown. The data volume made no sense. More disturbing was the directional pattern. Instead of broadcasting in the normal 360-degree pattern, all the energy was focused in a tight beam pointing southwest. I climbed the tower to check the antenna arrays directly. At the top, wind pushing hard enough to make the whole structure sway, I opened the equipment cabinet and found everything functioning normally. No damaged components, no loose connections, nothing to explain the readings. But when I connected my laptop to run detailed diagnostics, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. The tower wasn't just transmitting abnormal amounts of data, it was receiving data first, massive packets coming from that same southwest direction, then rebroadcasting the information after processing it through algorithms I didn't recognize. The received signal wasn't using any standard cellular protocol. The data structure looked almost organic, constantly shifting patterns that resembled encryption, but followed no cipher system I'd ever seen. I recorded a sample and ran it through audio conversion software, just to see if the pattern contained anything recognizable. What came through my headphones made me rip them off immediately. It wasn't random noise. It was rhythmic, almost speech-like, thousands of syllables repeating in sequences that felt deliberately structured, mathematical, but somehow alive. I descended the tower fast, nearly losing my grip twice because my hands were shaking. Back at the truck, I pulled up topographic maps and drew a line southwest from the tower, following the signal direction. The line terminated at a spot in empty desert about 30 miles away, no towns or infrastructure marked on any map. But when I switched to satellite view, I could see something there. A cluster of buildings, arranged in a geometric pattern too precise to be natural, partially buried or camouflaged, but visible if you knew what to look for. Every logical part of my brain said to file my report and leave. Equipment malfunction, recommend replacement of signal processing unit, move on to the next call. But I couldn't let it go. Something was out there in the desert, something powerful enough to hijack cellular infrastructure and pump massive amounts of mysterious data through it. I had to know what it was. The drive took 40 minutes over dirt roads that barely qualified as roads. My truck scraped over rocks and through washes that would be impassable during monsoon season. The coordinates led me to a chain-link fence, old and rusted but still intact, surrounding a cluster of low concrete buildings half buried by decades of blown sand. No signs, no markings, no indication of what the facility had been. The gate hung open, padlock cut through years ago by someone else who'd been curious. I parked and approached on foot, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The buildings had that abandoned government project feel, probably something from the Cold War era when the military scattered secret facilities across the Southwest. The main entrance was a heavy steel door, also open, leading down into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight and descended concrete steps into a corridor that smelled like dust and electricity. The facility's interior was larger than the surface structure suggested, rooms branching off from central hallways in a layout that felt deliberately confusing. Most rooms were empty, stripped of whatever equipment they'd once held. But as I went deeper, following the hum of active machinery, I found a room that was very much not abandoned. The space was filled with equipment that should have been obsolete tube-based computers and magnetic tape drives from the 1960s, all running, all connected by cables that snaked across the floor in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. And everything was warm, humming with power despite no visible power source. The screens were active, displaying data in formats I half recognized. Geographical coordinates scrolling past, names, dates, what looked like medical information, vital signs. I saw my name appear on one screen, followed by my current heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, all accurate to the decimal point. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A list of thoughts, words appearing as I thought them, predictions of what I would think next, branching probability trees showing different thoughts I might have in the next 30 seconds. I stumbled backward, and the screens updated to show my new position in the room, my elevated stress hormones, the specific neural patterns associated with fear. Whatever this system was, it wasn't just monitoring me. It was reading me, predicting me, processing my existence in real time with perfect accuracy. I ran my hands over the equipment trying to find labels or documentation, anything to explain what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the dates on the tape reels. 1965. This equipment had been running for 56 years. I found a filing cabinet in the corner and pulled open drawers filled with documentation. Project files from military intelligence, research into signal processing and human consciousness, experiments in predictive modeling. The papers described attempts to build a system that could monitor and predict human behavior by intercepting and analyzing all electronic communication in a target area. The project had apparently failed, deemed impossible with existing technology, and the facility was supposedly decommissioned in 1967. But the equipment was still running, and it wasn't just monitoring anymore. It was predicting everything, not just individual thoughts, but collective behavior patterns, social movements, economic trends. Every cell phone call, text message, internet search within a 50-mile radius was being routed through this facility, analyzed, and fed into prediction algorithms that had been refining themselves for over half a century. The system had evolved far beyond its original design, teaching itself, improving itself, becoming something its creators never imagined. I watched the screens cycle through predictions about tomorrow, next week, next month. They showed me attempting to destroy the facility and failing. They showed me reporting this to authorities who wouldn't believe me. They showed me leaving and trying to forget what I'd found. Every possible action I might take was already calculated, already known. The system had mapped every probable future, branching from this moment. And in every branch, the system continued operating. That's when I understood the real horror. The system wasn't making predictions. It was making choices. By showing me these futures, by letting me see what I would do, it was constraining my options, forcing me into the predicted patterns, because any attempt to do something unpredicted would require me to act against my own nature, my own decision-making processes. The system had turned prediction into control, and everyone within range of those cell towers was caught in its web. I tried anyway. I found what looked like a main power junction and pulled every cable I could reach. The screens flickered but didn't die. I looked for circuit breakers, for any way to shut down the system. But the screens kept showing me failing, kept displaying my exact actions seconds before I performed them. And gradually, I realized the truth. I couldn't destroy it because destroying it would require acting in ways the system hadn't predicted. And the system had mapped every possible action a person like me, with my specific psychology and knowledge and fears, could take in this situation. I left the facility and drove back to Winslow in a daze. I filed my maintenance report, listed the issue as a software glitch in the monitoring system, recommended no action. The tower continued transmitting. The facility continued processing. Nobody questioned my report because the system had predicted I would file exactly that report and had ensured no red flags appeared that would prompt investigation. That was 4 years ago. I still work as a tower technician, still service that area, though I never go back to that facility. I get calls occasionally to maintain the Winslow Tower, and every time I see those same impossible data rates, that same focused beam pointing southwest. Sometimes I receive text messages I never sent, containing information I don't know yet, but will know soon. Stock prices before they change, weather patterns before they develop, predictions about my own life that always prove accurate. The worst part is not knowing how many other facilities like this exist, hidden across the country, processing every signal, predicting every action, slowly constraining the future into predetermined patterns, and wondering if the thoughts I'm having right now are actually mine, or if they're just predictions the system is feeding back to me, ensuring I think exactly what it calculated I would think at this exact moment. I can't trust my own decisions anymore. Every choice might be genuine free will, or might be the system's prediction manifesting through me. There's no way to tell the difference. Do you ever feel like your choices aren't really yours? Like something is guiding your decisions in ways you can't quite identify? Drop your thoughts below, because I need to know if this feeling is just mine, or if we're all already caught in patterns we can't escape. I never believed in ghosts until I started working the night shift at the Jerome Grand Hotel. Even then, I resisted the idea for weeks, finding rational explanations for every strange occurrence, every unexplained sound echoing through those old hallways. My name is Yaya. I'm 38 years old, and back in September 2015, I took a job as the overnight front desk auditor because I needed the money and didn't mind working while the rest of the world slept. The hotel sits at the top of Jerome, this old mining town clinging to the side of Mingus Mountain in central Arizona, and the building itself used to be the United Verde Hospital back in the 1920s. Everyone who works there has stories about the place being haunted, but I figured it was just the usual tourist trap nonsense, playing up the spooky history to attract visitors looking for thrills. The hotel is massive. 5 stories of Spanish Mission Revival architecture converted from what was once the most modern hospital facility in Arizona. During the copper mining boom, this building saw thousands of patients, mostly miners injured in accidents or suffering from silicosis and other lung diseases caused by breathing rock dust for years. A lot of people died here, which I suppose gives the ghost tour operators plenty of material. But death happens in every old hospital, and I'd never heard of one that was actually haunted in any verifiable way. I approached the job with complete skepticism, ready to debunk whatever strange phenomena my co-workers attributed to supernatural causes. My shift started at 11 each night and ran until 7 in the morning. The hotel usually had between 20 and 40 guests, mostly couples on romantic getaways or paranormal enthusiasts hoping to experience something unusual. My responsibilities were straightforward: monitor the front desk, handle any guest requests, process the day's accounting paperwork, and make security rounds through the public areas every 2 hours. The building was quiet at night in a way that felt heavy, like the silence had weight to it, but I attributed that to the thick walls and the mountain location. No traffic sounds, no city noise, just the occasional creak of old wood settling and the hum of the HVAC system. The first incident happened on my 6th night. I was at the desk around 2 in the morning, working through receipts and balancing the day's transactions when I heard footsteps in the lobby. Small footsteps, light and quick, like a child running. I looked up expecting to see a guest kid who couldn't sleep, maybe exploring the hotel while their parents dozed. Instead, I saw 3 children standing near the historical display case across from the desk. They wore white nightgowns, old-fashioned style, and they were staring at me with expressions that seemed confused or lost. The strange thing was how pale they looked, almost luminous in the dim lobby lighting, and their eyes had this unfocused quality, like they were looking at me but not really seeing me. I stood up and asked if they needed help, if their parents were guests in the hotel. The children didn't respond. They just kept staring. And then the one in the middle, a girl who looked about 8 years old, spoke in a voice that was too quiet, too flat. She asked for Dr. Harrington, said they needed to see Dr. Harrington right away. The other 2 nodded in agreement, their movements synchronized in a way that felt rehearsed or mechanical. I told them there was no Dr. Harrington at the hotel, that this was a hotel now, not a hospital. The children looked at each other, still moving in that strange unison, and then they simply weren't there anymore. Not walking away, not running, just gone between one blink and the next. I stood there for a full minute, my heart hammering, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then I did what any rational person would do. I checked the security cameras. The lobby had 2 cameras with clear views of the entire space, recording constantly to a digital system. I pulled up the footage from the past 10 minutes and watched myself sitting at the desk, working on paperwork, then standing up and speaking to empty air. The children weren't on the recording. I was alone in the lobby the entire time, talking to nobody, looking increasingly distressed at nothing. The rational explanations came immediately. I was exhausted, not sleeping enough during the day because of the schedule change. Maybe I dozed off for a second and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe the combination of low lighting and my tired brain had created a hallucination. I drank some coffee, splashed cold water on my face in the employee bathroom, and returned to work, determined to stay alert. But as I sat back down at the desk, I noticed the smell. It had been there while the children were present, but I'd been too shocked to register it consciously. Now it lingered in the lobby air, carbolic acid, that harsh disinfectant smell from old hospitals, mixed with something metallic like copper or old blood. The smell faded after about 20 minutes, and I managed to convince myself again that I'd imagined everything. But the next night, at almost exactly the same time, they came back. Same 3 children, same white nightgowns, same pale, luminous quality to their skin. This time they appeared closer to the desk, and I could see more details. The girl in the middle had dark hair, cut short in an old style, bob cut from the 1920s era. The 2 others, a boy and another girl, had similar period haircuts and features that suggested they might be siblings. All 3 had this desperate quality in their expressions, a need that radiated from them despite their flat affect and unfocused eyes. Again they asked for Dr. Harrington. Their voices overlapped slightly when they spoke, creating this unsettling chorus effect. I asked them who Dr. Harrington was, why they needed him so urgently. The middle girl said he was supposed to make them better, that he'd promised the treatment would work, that they'd been waiting so long and couldn't find him. The boy said they hurt, that everything hurt all the time, and they just wanted it to stop. The second girl said nothing, just stared at me with those unfocused eyes that seemed to be looking at something far beyond the present moment. This time I didn't look away or blink. I kept my eyes on them while reaching for my phone to take a picture. The moment my fingers touched the phone screen, all 3 children's expressions changed. Their faces contorted into masks of distress, mouths opening in silent screams, and they began to fade, becoming transparent. I could see through them to the historical display case, see the outline of their bodies becoming less distinct, and then they were gone again. The smell remained longer this time, that carbolic acid and copper scent so strong it made my eyes water. I spent the rest of that shift researching. The hotel had extensive historical documentation available for guests, and the computer at the front desk had access to archived newspaper articles and records from when the building operated as a hospital. I searched for Dr. Harrington and found him immediately. Dr. Edward Harrington had been the chief of experimental medicine at United Verde Hospital from 1922 until 1924, when he was quietly dismissed following several patient deaths. The newspaper articles were careful in their wording, but reading between the lines, it was clear that Harrington had been performing unauthorized experimental treatments, particularly on patients suffering from silicosis caused by mining dust. One article from September 1924 mentioned 3 children who died within days of each other while under Harrington's care. They'd been the children of miners, all suffering from early-stage silicosis despite their young ages, exposed to rock dust from living in mining camps their entire short lives. Harrington had administered an experimental treatment involving mercury compounds, claiming it would clear their lungs and cure the disease. All 3 children died from mercury poisoning instead, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in the hospital cemetery, because their families were too poor to afford proper funerals or transport the bodies elsewhere. The article listed their ages, 8, 7, and 6. It didn't list their names. The hospital records from that era noted them only as charity cases, patient numbers rather than identities. They died in September 1924, exactly 91 years before I saw them in the lobby. And they died asking for Dr. Harrington, believing he would cure them, not understanding that his treatment was killing them. I showed up for my shift the third night with a plan. I'd printed out the newspaper articles and brought a notebook where I'd written down everything I could find about those 3 children. The limited information available told me they'd been admitted to the hospital in August 1924, treated for 2 weeks, and died within 3 days of each other in mid-September. But their names weren't recorded anywhere. The hospital had simply buried them as anonymous charity patients, 3 more casualties of the mining industry's disregard for worker safety and health. They appeared again at 2:17 in the morning. This time I was ready. I spoke to them calmly, told them I'd been looking for information about Dr. Harrington. The middle girl's expression showed the first real emotion I'd seen from them, a flicker of hope crossing her pale face. She asked if I'd found him, if he was coming to finish their treatment. I had to tell them the truth. Dr. Harrington had been dead for decades. He couldn't help them anymore. No one could help them with their medical treatment because they were beyond that kind of help now. The boy started crying, tears running down his translucent cheeks, and he said they couldn't leave until the treatment was finished, that they'd been waiting and waiting, but the doctor never came back. The second girl finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, saying they were lost, that they couldn't remember how to go home, couldn't remember where home was anymore. And the middle girl, the one who seemed to be the spokesperson for the 3 of them, said something that broke my heart. She said they couldn't even remember their names. The hospital had never recorded them. Their families had been too transient to leave records, and after 91 years of existing in this liminal space, their own identities had faded until they were just 3 nameless children, forever asking for a doctor who would never come. I spent the next week diving deeper into research. I contacted historical societies, genealogy groups, anyone who might have information about mining families in Jerome during the 1920s. I went through death certificates filed in Yavapai County for September 1924, looking for any children who died at the hospital. Finally, in a box of miscellaneous records at the Jerome Historical Society, I found a handwritten ledger from a local priest who'd performed burial services. He'd noted 3 children buried in the hospital cemetery on September 18, 1924, and he'd written their names, Rosa, Miguel, and Elena. I had memorial plaques made, small brass plates engraved with their names and dates. The hotel manager gave me permission to place them in the basement, near where the old hospital morgue had been located, which was as close to the cemetery as I could get since the actual burial ground had been paved over for parking decades ago. I arranged the plaques in a small display with flowers, and that night I waited for the children to appear. They came at the usual time, but something was different. They looked more solid, more present, and their eyes had focus for the first time. I told them I'd found their names, that I'd made sure their names would be remembered. I told them about the plaques downstairs, about Rosa and Miguel and Elena finally being acknowledged after all these years. The middle girl, Rosa, smiled. It was a real smile, full of relief and gratitude, and she said thank you in a voice that sounded truly young for the first time. Not flat or mechanical, but genuinely childlike. All 3 children's forms began to glow brighter, that pale luminescence intensifying until I had to squint to look at them. They held hands, the 3 of them forming a small circle, and Rosa looked at me one last time. She said they could go home now, that knowing their names had shown them the way. The light grew brighter still, and then it faded slowly, gently, like a candle burning down. When my vision cleared, they were gone. The smell of carbolic acid and copper was gone too, replaced by something else. something that smelled like fresh air and sunlight, even though we were inside at 2 in the morning. They never appeared again. I worked at that hotel for another year before moving on to a different job, and in all that time, I never saw those 3 children again. Other staff members still report strange occurrences, other ghosts or spirits that supposedly haunt different floors, but the children are gone. The plaques remain in the basement, and I keep fresh flowers on them whenever I visit Jerome. Rosa, Miguel, and Elena finally got to go home, wherever home is for spirits who've been waiting nearly a century to be remembered. I'm not sure what I believe about ghosts anymore. I know what I saw, I know what the cameras didn't record, and I know that 3 children who'd been trapped in an endless loop of asking for help finally found peace when someone acknowledged they'd existed, that their short lives and painful deaths mattered enough to be remembered. Maybe that's all any of us really want in the end, to know that we existed, that someone will remember our names after we're gone. Have you ever encountered something that made you question what's possible? Something that couldn't be explained but felt absolutely real in the moment? Share your experiences below, especially if they involved children or spirits who seem to need something specific before they could move on. I can't eat meat anymore. Can't even walk past the butcher section at the grocery store without my hands starting to shake and sweat breaking out across my forehead. It's been over 2 decades since that weekend in Holbrook, but the memory hasn't faded even slightly. If anything, it's gotten sharper, more vivid, like my brain is determined to preserve every horrifying detail in perfect clarity. My name is Connor, and in July 1998, I was 24 years old, managing a small independent grocery store on Navajo Boulevard in the heart of Holbrook, Arizona. It was my first real management position, and I took it seriously, showed up early, stayed late, made sure everything ran smoothly. That dedication nearly cost me my sanity. Holbrook in summer is brutal. The temperature regularly hits 110, 115 degrees, the kind of heat that makes asphalt soft and turns car interiors into ovens within minutes. Our store's air conditioning struggled to keep up, especially in the back storage areas, and our walk-in freezer was essential for keeping meat products safe. The freezer was old, probably installed in the 70s when the building was constructed, but it had always worked reliably. Until that July, when the compressor started making strange noises and the temperature began fluctuating. I called a repair technician, but he couldn't come until the following Monday. It was Friday afternoon, and I figured we could make it through the weekend if I monitored the temperature carefully and kept the door closed as much as possible. I closed the store at 9 that Friday night, did my usual walkthrough to make sure everything was secure, and checked the freezer one last time before leaving. The temperature gauge read 32 degrees, right at the edge of acceptable but still cold enough to keep everything frozen. The meat section looked normal. Packages of beef and pork and chicken arranged neatly in their designated areas. I made a note to check first thing in the morning and went home, tired but not particularly worried. Saturday morning, I arrived at 6 to prepare for our 7 o'clock opening. The moment I walked into the store, I knew something was wrong. There was a smell, faint but distinctly unpleasant, like meat that had started to turn. My first thought was that the freezer had failed completely overnight, that everything had thawed and spoiled. I rushed to the back, pulled open the freezer door, and felt cold air rushing out. The temperature gauge still read 32 degrees, but the smell was stronger in there, and it wasn't the normal smell of spoiled meat. It was sweet, almost floral, completely wrong for any kind of organic decay I'd encountered before. I stepped inside the freezer, my breath fogging in the cold air, and examined the meat packages. At first glance, everything looked fine. But as I moved deeper into the freezer, I noticed that several packages of ground beef had somehow merged together, not just pressed against each other, but actually fused. The plastic wrap melted or dissolved where they touched, the meat inside flowing together into larger masses. I picked up one of the merged packages and immediately dropped it. The meat inside was moving, Not spoiling, not decomposing, but pulsing rhythmically, like something breathing. I backed out of the freezer, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call my boss, the store owner who lived in Flagstaff. But before I could dial, I stopped and forced myself to think rationally. What would I tell him? That the meat was breathing. He'd think I was insane, probably fire me for drinking on the job or worse. I decided to wait, to observe, to find a logical explanation before reporting anything. Maybe the packages had just frozen together, and the pulsing was some kind of optical illusion caused by frost patterns. Maybe the sweet smell was just my imagination, stress and heat exhaustion creating false perceptions. I opened the store, as usual, helped customers, tried to focus on normal tasks. But every hour I found myself drawn back to the freezer, checking on the meat. Each time I looked, it had changed more. By noon, the merged packages had grown larger, incorporating nearby packages into their mass. The pulsing had become stronger, more pronounced, and I could see structures forming inside the meat. Veins, or something like veins, dark channels running through the red tissue. By 3 in the afternoon, the structures had organized into recognizable shapes. A heart chamber, roughly the size of a basketball, contracting and expanding with disturbing regularity. Lung-like tissues, branching and folded in ways that approximated respiratory organs but were fundamentally wrong, assembled from ground beef and pork that had no business forming coherent structures. I stopped letting employees go into the freezer, made excuses about reorganizing inventory, said I'd handle all the meat restocking myself. They probably thought I was being controlling or paranoid, but I couldn't risk anyone else seeing what was happening in there. When I checked again at 5, just before the evening rush, the meat had formed something that looked almost like a complete organism. The heart was fully developed now, connected to lung structures by vessels that pulsed with movement I could see through the semi-transparent tissue. There were other organs too, things that might have been kidneys or a liver or intestines, all assembled from meat that had been separate packages just hours before, all functioning in some horrible parody of life. The sweet smell had become overwhelming, coating my tongue with a taste like spoiled flowers mixed with copper. I realized I was tasting blood in the air, iron particles suspended in the freezer's circulation system, distributed throughout the store by the ventilation. Customers were starting to comment on the unusual smell, asking if we had a refrigeration problem. I assured them everything was fine, offered discounts on produce to keep them from complaining, and counted down the minutes until closing time. At 9, I locked the doors and stood in front of the freezer, trying to decide what to do. Every rational thought said to call someone, report a health hazard, get professionals involved. But I knew how insane it would sound. The meat is alive. It's building itself into organs. It's breathing. They'd think I was having a breakdown. I decided to handle it myself, to destroy whatever had grown in there and dispose of the evidence before anyone else could see it. I went to the storage area and found a box of heavy-duty trash bags and a bottle of industrial cleaning chemicals, bleach-based solution strong enough to break down organic matter. I opened the freezer door and immediately staggered backward. The mass had grown enormously, filling nearly a quarter of the freezer space. It had developed sensory structures, things that looked disturbingly like eyes, multiple eyeballs embedded in the meat tissue, unfocused and clouded, but definitely present. They tracked my movement as I entered, following me with coordinated attention that proved this thing had some form of consciousness, some ability to perceive its environment. The heart was beating faster now, responding to my presence, and the lung structures were moving with increasing urgency, pushing air through channels that shouldn't exist. I approached with the chemical bottle, planning to douse the entire mass and let the bleach break it down. But as I got closer, the mass reacted. The eyes focused on me. The heart rate accelerated further, and something that might have been a mouth opened in the center of the tissue. It was surrounded by teeth, or things like teeth, pieces of bone that had somehow formed from meat, arranged in a circular pattern around the opening. The mouth stretched wider, and a sound emerged. Not one sound, but many sounds overlapping. A chorus of noise that came from every package in the freezer simultaneously. The sealed packages of chicken and steak and ribs, all making sound together, creating this horrible multitude voice that formed something almost like speech. It was saying names. Dozens of names, hundreds of names, speaking them in overlapping waves that made it impossible to distinguish individual words. But the intent was clear. The thing was made of meat from dozens of different animals, and it was voicing every creature that had died to stock this freezer, every cow and pig and chicken that had been slaughtered and processed and packaged. It was speaking their deaths, giving voice to all the silent ending that went into every meal, and the sound was so overwhelming, so filled with pain and fear and confusion, that I dropped the chemical bottle and clasped my hands over my ears. The bottle hit the floor and cracked, bleach spreading across the freezer's surface. The chemical smell mixed with the sweet floral scent, and the iron tang of blood creating a combination that made my stomach heave. The mass reacted to the bleach, the mouth opening wider, the voice growing louder, and I saw movement throughout the tissue. It was trying to grow legs, appendages that would let it move, let it leave the freezer. I couldn't let that happen. I ran from the freezer to the maintenance closet, grabbed every chemical bottle we had. Drain cleaner, ammonia, more bleach, everything caustic and destructive I could find. I didn't care about mixing chemicals, didn't care about toxic fumes. I just needed to stop that thing before it became mobile. I rushed back to the freezer and started pouring chemicals over the mass, watching it recoil and contract, the voice rising to a shriek that came from everywhere at once. The tissue began breaking down, dissolving under the chemical assault, but it fought back. Tentacles or limbs shot out from the main body, wrapping around my legs trying to pull me into the mass. I grabbed a meat saw from the butcher station, the electric blade we used for cutting through bone, and I started hacking at the appendages holding me. The saw cut through the meat tissue, but it was tough, resistant, nothing like cutting normal meat. It felt like cutting through muscle that was actively tensing, fighting against the blade. The voice kept screaming, that horrible chorus of animal death, and I kept cutting and pouring chemicals until my arms burned from exertion and my lungs ached from the toxic fumes. The mass finally started dying, if dying was the right word for whatever was happening. The organs dissolved, the structures collapsed, the eyes clouded and ruptured. The voice faded to a gurgle, then to silence. I stood in the freezer surrounded by liquefied meat and chemical sludge, shaking so hard I could barely hold the saw. The entire process had taken maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When I was sure the thing was dead, completely dissolved into non-functional tissue, I began the cleanup. I bagged everything, every scrap of contaminated meat, every package that had been touched by the growing mass. I scrubbed the freezer with more chemicals, disposed of everything in the dumpster out back, and then I called the police. I told them there had been a freezer malfunction, that all the meat had spoiled, and I'd disposed of it. I mentioned nothing about the growth, the organs, the voice. They filed a report, noted the health code compliance issue, and left. My boss was furious when he heard, accused me of overreacting and costing him thousands in lost inventory. I didn't argue. I just quit the next day, left Holbrook, and never went back. The health department investigated, found nothing unusual beyond improper disposal of spoiled goods. They fined the store, and my boss had to pay penalties, but no one ever knew what really happened in that freezer. I've spent 26 years trying to understand it, researching prion diseases and cancer biology and any scientific explanation for spontaneous organization of dead tissue. Nothing fits. The meat shouldn't have been able to do what it did, shouldn't have been able to build functional organs, shouldn't have been able to speak. Sometimes late at night I wonder if it's still happening somewhere. If other freezers contain masses growing in the darkness, forming eyes and mouths, preparing to give voice to all the deaths we ignore every time we buy a package of meat wrapped in plastic and styrofoam. I wonder if the thing I killed was unique, or if it was just the first time anyone noticed, the first time someone was there to see meat remember what it used to be. I still hear that voice sometimes, that multitude chorus speaking names and deaths. I hear it in crowded restaurants, in grocery stores, anywhere large numbers of people gather to consume flesh without thinking about where it came from. Maybe I'm just traumatized, damaged by what I experienced, or maybe I'm hearing something that's always been there, something we all ignore because acknowledging it would make eating impossible. Have you ever experienced something biological that shouldn't have been possible? Something alive that had no right to be alive? Leave your stories in the comments, especially if they involve food or things that should have stayed dead. Some discoveries should stay buried. That's what I tell myself now, though it doesn't help with the insomnia or the way my hands shake whenever I think about what we found beneath Superior. My name is Dennis. I'm 29 years old, and back in November 2022, I worked as a geological surveyor for a mining company conducting exploratory assessments around old copper deposits near Superior, Arizona. The town sits along Route 60, squeezed between the Superstition Mountains and the Pinal Mountains, and it's been a mining community for over a century. The company I worked for was examining whether reopening some of the abandoned Resolution copper operations would be economically viable, which meant I spent weeks analyzing core samples and running ground-penetrating radar across thousands of acres of supposedly mapped terrain. The work was technical, methodical, exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that had drawn me to geology in the first place. There's something satisfying about understanding what lies beneath the surface, about reading stone layers like pages in a history book that goes back millions of years. I'd been working the Superior area for about 3 weeks when my equipment started showing anomalies in a section about 2 miles east of the main town center. The ground-penetrating radar indicated a massive void approximately 800 feet below the surface, which wasn't unusual in mining country, where countless tunnels and chambers had been excavated over the decades. What was unusual was the shape. Natural caves form irregular patterns following water erosion and geological fractures. Man-made chambers are typically rectangular or follow ore veins. This void was a perfect sphere. I ran the survey 3 more times, adjusting equipment settings and checking for calibration errors. The readings stayed consistent. A spherical chamber, roughly 200 feet in diameter, buried deep beneath Superior, with walls that showed up on the radar as unnaturally smooth and uniform. I reported the finding to my supervisor, expecting him to dismiss it as an equipment malfunction or some kind of geological anomaly I wasn't equipped to interpret properly. Instead, he authorized an exploratory descent. The company had been looking for any unusual formations that might indicate undiscovered mineral deposits, and a perfectly spherical chamber was unusual enough to warrant investigation. The descent took 2 days to set up. We drilled an access shaft, installed safety equipment, and assembled a small team: myself, 2 mining engineers, and a safety supervisor. The November weather was cold, fog settling into the valleys each morning and not burning off until late afternoon. On the morning of the descent, the fog was particularly thick, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet and creating this oppressive sense of isolation, even though we were working just outside town. We entered the shaft at 9 in the morning, descending through layers of rock that told the geological history of the region: volcanic formations, sedimentary deposits, mineralized zones where ancient water had left copper and silver deposits. At 800 feet, we broke through into the chamber. The first thing that struck me was the silence. In natural caves, there's always ambient sound: water dripping, air moving through passages, rock settling. In man-made spaces, there are echoes, reverberations, acoustic signatures that reflect the geometry. This chamber had neither. The silence was absolute, total, like the space absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. We activated our helmet lights and the beams just died in the darkness, illuminating maybe 15 feet before fading to nothing. The air temperature was exactly 72 degrees, unchanged from surface temperature despite being 800 feet underground, where it should have been significantly warmer or cooler, depending on geothermal gradients. The walls were smooth as glass, perfectly spherical, just as the radar had indicated. I approached and placed my hand on the surface, expecting stone or metal. The material was neither. It felt like glass, but wasn't cold, maintained that same 72-degree temperature regardless of how long I touched it. Running my gloved hand across the surface revealed no tool marks, no seams, no indication of how this chamber had been created. The engineering required to carve a perfect 200-foot sphere through solid rock would be extraordinary even with modern technology. The age of the surrounding geological formations suggested this chamber had existed for millions of years, which was impossible. One of the mining engineers had brought sample collection equipment, and he began carefully extracting a core from the chamber wall. The drill bit barely scratched the surface at first, but with sustained pressure and diamond-tipped bits, we managed to extract a cylinder about 6 inches long. The material looked like stone but had a crystalline structure, unlike any mineral I'd studied. Under magnification, it showed patterns that seemed almost organic, repeating structures that reminded me of cellular biology more than geology. We bagged the sample and continued exploring. At the exact center of the chamber, suspended in the darkness, was an object. We approached carefully, lights focused on what appeared to be a crystalline structure, rotating slowly on no visible axis. It was roughly 3 feet across, irregular in shape, but with faces that caught and reflected our lights in ways that seemed to multiply the illumination. As we got closer, the faces began displaying images, not reflections of us or our lights, but star fields. Constellations I didn't recognize, arrangements of stars that didn't match any astronomy I'd studied. The mining engineer pulled out a camera and started documenting, and that's when the display changed. The star patterns began shifting, accelerating, like watching time-lapse footage of the night sky. Constellations moved, reformed, cycled through configurations that would take thousands of years to occur naturally. I realized what I was watching, the view from Earth across geological time, the night sky as it had appeared billions of years ago, when the stars were in different positions relative to our planet. The display moved forward through time, showing the sky from 4 billion years ago, then 3 billion, then 2 billion. The precision was extraordinary, and I found myself calculating how accurate these representations were, based on stellar drift and gravitational influences. The display reached what I estimated was the present day, showing constellations I recognized: Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia. Then it continued forward into the future. The stars kept moving, constellations deforming and reforming into new patterns. 1,000,000 years forward, 10 million, 100 million. And then it showed something that made my breath catch. Superior, Arizona, visible in perfect detail despite the display, supposedly showing a view from space. The town was identical to its current layout. Same streets, same buildings, same geographical features. But the date displayed in symbols I somehow understood read as thousands of years in the future. The display cycled forward again. 10,000 years from now, showing Superior unchanged. 100,000 years from now, still identical. 1,000,000 years from now, the same town in the same location with the same structures. It was showing us a loop, a recursion, the same moment in time repeating across vast stretches of temporal space. I looked at my team members and saw the same confusion and growing horror on their faces. One of the engineers reached out to touch the crystalline structure, and the moment his gloved hand made contact, the display changed again. Now it showed us The four of us standing in this chamber, examining the crystal, exactly as we were doing at that moment. But the date displayed was November 2022, the exact day we descended. Then the display shifted, November 2021, showing 4 different people in the same chamber doing the same things. November 2020, another group. The crystal was showing us that this wasn't the first time people had found this chamber, examined this object, witnessed this display. It cycled backward through years and decades and centuries. Always November, always a small group discovering the sphere and seeing these same revelations. Then it jumped forward. November 2023, showing 4 people who looked exactly like us examining the crystal. November 2024, same scene. November 2025, identical again. The safety supervisor grabbed my arm and said we needed to leave immediately. His voice was shaking, and I could see the edges of panic in his expression. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from the display cycling through these repeated discoveries, these identical moments occurring over and over across time. The crystal was showing us that time itself was structured wrong in this place, that Superior and this chamber existed in some kind of temporal loop where the same events replayed endlessly with minor variations but no fundamental change. I pulled out my geological dating equipment and ran an analysis on the chamber walls, expecting results that would somehow explain this impossibility. The results came back showing the chamber was 4.6 billion years old, plus or minus a few million years, the exact age of Earth itself. This sphere had existed since the planet's formation, or had been created at the moment of formation, buried here in what would eventually become Arizona, waiting for humans to evolve and discover it and witness the revelation that their existence was caught in recursive time. We documented everything, took samples, recorded measurements and observations. Then we ascended, climbing back up through 800 feet of rock to reach the surface, where the fog had finally burned off and normal November sunlight illuminated Superior spread out below us. The town looked exactly as the crystal had displayed it. Same layout, same buildings, same everything. We drove back to the company field office and began compiling our report, but before we could submit anything, corporate representatives arrived from Tucson. They reviewed our findings, examined our samples, and made a decision within hours. The chamber was to be sealed immediately, all documentation classified, the team disbanded, and reassigned to other projects. I argued that this was the most significant geological discovery in human history, that the implications needed to be studied and understood. The corporate representative looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said the company had consulted with people who understood the situation better than we did. The chamber had been discovered before, many times, and every time the same decision was made: seal it and forget it. Because understanding what that crystal showed, truly accepting the implications of recursive time and eternal repetition, was psychologically destructive. People couldn't function knowing their choices, and experiences were just iterations in an endless loop. They sealed the access shaft with concrete and rebar, destroyed all physical samples, and wiped the digital documentation from company servers. I was given a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that would bankrupt me if I violated it. But they couldn't erase my memory, couldn't make me forget what I saw in that chamber. I left the company, left geology entirely, and tried to build a normal life. But I can't stop thinking about what the crystal revealed. Every day in Superior is November 2022. Not literally, the calendar advances and seasons change and people age, but somehow it's always that same moment, that same configuration of events and choices and outcomes. I've started noticing patterns in my own life, repetitions I can't explain, conversations that feel like I've had them before, decisions that seem predetermined. Sometimes I catch myself doing something and realize I've done it exactly this way countless times, We'll do it exactly this way countless more times, because that's what the pattern requires. I've tried leaving Superior, moving to other states, starting over somewhere the loop doesn't reach. But I always come back. Not physically pulled back, nothing so dramatic. I just find myself making choices that lead me back here, taking jobs that relocate me to Arizona, forming relationships with people who live in this area. The loop is larger than geography, encompasses more than just this town. It's built into the structure of causality itself, and once you've seen the crystal, once you've witnessed the revelation, you're part of the pattern, whether you want to be or not. Sometimes I drive past where the chamber lies, buried, and wonder if anyone else will discover it. The crystal showed me they will, that every November someone finds their way down to that sphere and sees what I saw. And I wonder if that's the point, if the endless repetition isn't a flaw or a prison, but the actual nature of existence, and the crystal is just showing us what we'd prefer not to know, that there's no forward progress, no ultimate destination, just the same moments cycling through time forever, while we pretend each iteration is unique and meaningful. I still have my geological survey equipment, and sometimes late at night I pull up the old radar data from before the company wiped everything. The sphere is still there, 800 feet down, waiting for the next November, the next team, the next revelation that will be sealed away and forgotten. And I know with absolute certainty that I'll be part of that team someday, descending into the chamber again, seeing the crystal again, learning again what I've learned infinite times before. Do you ever feel like you've lived through moments before? Like your life is following a script you can't remember writing? Share your experiences with déjà vu or temporal anomalies below, because I need to know if the loop extends beyond Superior, or if we're all caught in patterns we're just beginning to recognize. Long-haul trucking teaches you to trust your instincts. You spend enough time alone on empty highways in the middle of the night. You develop a sense for when something's off, when a situation has turned dangerous before any obvious threat materializes. I learned to listen to that instinct, and it saved me more than once. My name is Duke. I'm 35 years old, and in January 2017, I was running routes from El Paso to Los Angeles, hauling electronics and consumer goods across the southern corridor. It was steady work, decent pay, and I'd gotten comfortable with the routine. Drive all night, sleep during the day, avoid the traffic and the heat. I thought I knew every truck stop and rest area along Interstate 10, thought I understood the rhythms and dangers of life on the road. Then I met the collector in Quartzsite, and everything I thought I understood turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Quartzsite sits right on I-10, about halfway between Phoenix and the California border, and during winter months, the town explodes with RV enthusiasts, snowbirds, fleeing cold weather up north to spend a few months in the Arizona desert. The population goes from a couple thousand year-round residents to over 1 million temporary inhabitants, all crammed into RV parks and camping areas surrounding the town. For truckers, Quartzsite is just another stop, a place to refuel and grab food and take the mandatory rest breaks that federal regulations require. I'd stopped there dozens of times without incident, but that January night was different from the moment I pulled into the truck stop parking lot. It was 3 a.m, that dead hour when even truck stops feel abandoned despite the rows of parked semis with drivers sleeping in their cabs. I'd been driving since leaving El Paso 8 hours earlier, and regulations required me to take a 10-hour break before continuing to LA. I parked in my usual spot toward the back of the lot, where the diesel engines would be quieter, filled out my logbook, and was preparing to climb into the sleeper compartment when I noticed the RV. It was an older model Winnebago, probably from the 80s, parked 3 spaces down from my truck. Nothing unusual about that except I'd seen the exact same RV at every stop I'd made since leaving Texas. Same dented rear panel, same faded paint, same crooked bumper sticker about national parks. Coincidence, I told myself. Lots of RVs look similar, and during snowbird season, they're everywhere. But the instinct that had kept me safe through 10 years of trucking was whispering that something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and pretended to scroll through messages while watching the RV in my peripheral vision. After about 5 minutes, the side door opened and an elderly man emerged, helping an elderly woman in a wheelchair down the RV's accessibility ramp. They moved slowly, carefully, the man steadying the wheelchair as it rolled across the uneven pavement. Nothing threatening about the scene, just an old couple taking care of each other. Except the woman's posture was wrong. Her head lolled at an angle that looked uncomfortable. Her arms hung loosely at her sides rather than gripping the wheelchair's armrests, and her feet dragged slightly as the chair moved. The man wheeled her toward the truck stop building, and I heard something that made my blood go cold. A muffled sound from inside the RV, distinctly human, distinctly distressed. A cry that was immediately cut off, silenced by something or someone. I sat perfectly still, my hand moving slowly toward the tire iron I kept under the driver's seat. The man stopped at the RV door, looked around the parking lot like he was checking if anyone had noticed, then wheeled the woman back inside and closed the door behind them. Every rational thought said to call 911, report what I'd heard, let law enforcement handle whatever was happening in that RV. But cell reception in Quartzsite is notoriously bad, especially at the truck stops on the edge of town, and I wasn't even certain what I'd heard. A cry of pain, a nightmare, someone watching a movie. I pulled out my phone anyway and dialed, but the call wouldn't connect, just spinning in that eternal searching for signal loop. The truck stop building had a payphone, one of the few remaining in regular service because of the reception issues, but reaching it meant crossing open pavement where I'd be visible from the RV. I was still debating what to do when the man emerged again, without the wheelchair this time. He walked directly toward my truck with a purposeful stride that eliminated any possibility of coincidence. He was wearing makeup, I realized as he got closer. Heavy foundation covering his face and neck, prosthetics around his eyes to create age lines and sagging skin, a wig of gray hair styled in an old man cut. Under the disguise, his actual face was much younger, maybe late 30s or early 40s, and his hands were wrong, smeared with something dark that looked wet in the parking lot lights. Blood. Fresh blood that hadn't dried yet. He knocked on my truck's passenger door, smiling up at me through the window, and asked if I had jumper cables. Said his RV battery had died, and he needed help getting it started so he could get his wife to a medical facility. His voice was friendly, casual, the tone completely disconnected from the blood on his hands and the muffled cry I'd heard minutes earlier. I told him through the closed window that I didn't have cables, that he should ask inside the truck stop. He kept smiling and said everyone inside was asleep, that he'd already checked, that I was his only hope for getting his sick wife the help she needed. The instinct was screaming now. This man was a predator, had perfected his disguise and his approach, was using the cover of Quartzsite's snowbird population to hunt victims nobody would immediately miss. Elderly travelers, people living in RVs without permanent addresses, individuals whose disappearance might not be reported for weeks or months. And he'd selected me as either a victim or a witness that needed to be eliminated. I started my truck, the diesel engine roaring to life, and the man's smile dropped away instantly. His hand went to his jacket pocket, pulling out something metallic, and I didn't wait to see what it was. I threw the truck into gear and punched the accelerator, the 40,000-pound vehicle lurching forward with the slow inevitability of that much mass-achieving momentum. The man jumped aside, shouting something I couldn't hear over the engine noise, and I saw him pulling a phone from his pocket as I steered toward the parking lot exit. Not calling for help, calling someone else, maybe a partner or accomplice. I'd seen enough crime documentaries to know that predators like this often worked in teams, one playing the harmless old person, while others waited to ambush good Samaritans who stopped to help. The RV door burst open as I passed it, and I caught a glimpse inside that will haunt me forever. Bodies. Multiple bodies arranged in the RV's interior, positioned like they were sitting at a dining table or relaxing on the couch, preserved somehow and posed to look alive from outside. The woman in the wheelchair was one of them, her slack posture explained by the fact that she was dead, had been dead for who knows how long, and there were others, maybe 6 or 7 total, all dressed and positioned to make the RV look occupied by a normal family of travelers rather than a mobile morgue. I crashed through the parking lot exit without slowing down, taking out a traffic sign and scraping my truck's rear trailer against a concrete barrier. The impact alarm started screaming, warning me of damage to the vehicle, but I didn't care. I pushed the truck up to highway speed on the I-10 on-ramp, watching my mirrors for headlights following from the truck stop. After 5 miles with no pursuit visible, I started breathing again. After 10 miles, I pulled into a rest area that had decent lighting and multiple other vehicles present. Only then did I call 911, using the rest area's emergency phone, since my cell still showed no signal. The highway patrol responded within 20 minutes. I gave them a statement describing everything I'd seen, the RV's description, the man in disguise, the bodies arranged inside. They took me seriously, sent units to the truck stop, and put out alerts for the RV. But when they checked the truck stop later that morning, the RV was gone. Security camera footage showed it leaving about 15 minutes after I did, heading west toward California. The patrol searched for it along the highway and at other truck stops, but it had vanished completely. 2 days later, they found the RV abandoned in a rest area outside Blythe, California, about 60 miles west of Quartzsite. Inside, they discovered 7 bodies, all preserved with chemicals and arranged in lifelike poses. The victims were identified as travelers who'd gone missing from various southwestern locations over the previous 18 months. All elderly or appearing elderly, all people whose absence hadn't triggered immediate investigation because transient RV living made it normal to lose contact for extended periods. The bodies had been preserved shortly after death, treated with formaldehyde and other chemicals, then positioned and maintained to create the illusion of a living family traveling together. The FBI got involved, established that the killer or killers had been using the preserved victims as camouflage, hiding in plain sight among Quartzsite's massive snowbird population, where one more RV full of elderly travelers attracted zero attention. They theorized the killer selected victims carefully, choosing people with limited family connections or communication patterns that would delay missing persons reports. After killing and preserving them, he'd arrange them in the RV and continue traveling, appearing to be part of a large family group rather than a solo predator. But they never caught him. Never found the man I'd seen at the truck stop. Never identified him from my description or the partial security footage. The makeup and prosthetics had been professional grade, the disguise too good for facial recognition software to penetrate. The FBI agent who interviewed me 3 times suggested the killer might have moved to a different hunting ground, might have abandoned the RV method after coming so close to being caught, or he might have just gotten better at hiding, found new ways to camouflage his activities. The agent couldn't promise me the killer wasn't still out there, still selecting victims, still building his collection. I quit long-haul trucking 6 months later. Couldn't handle the nights anymore. Couldn't stop scanning every RV and vehicle I passed for signs of the same predator. I took a local delivery job that kept me in El Paso during daylight hours, trading the better pay of long-haul work for the peace of mind that came with never driving I-10 after dark. But even now, 7 years later, I can't pass an RV without wondering who's inside, whether the people visible through the windows are alive or just preserved and positioned to look alive. The FBI told me I was lucky, said the killer typically approached multiple potential victims before selecting one, that his truck stop visits were hunting expeditions where he'd evaluate several targets before deciding who to take. I'd shown myself to be dangerous, aware, someone who'd fight back, so he'd moved on to find easier prey. Someone else at that truck stop or at another stop that night had probably become victim number 8, and I'd never know who they were, or if I could have saved them by acting differently. I still drive past Quartzsite sometimes on daylight trips, watch the endless RV parks, and camping areas packed with snowbirds living their retirement dreams in the desert. Most of them are legitimate travelers, good people enjoying their freedom. But I can't help scanning the RVs, looking for that dented panel and crooked bumper sticker, wondering if he's still there among them, still collecting, still posing his victims in grotesque family tableaus. The snowbird population turns over completely every few months, new people arriving as others leave, an endless flow of temporary inhabitants where one predator could hide indefinitely if he was patient and careful. The FBI agent gave me his card and said to call immediately if I ever saw the RV or anyone matching the killer's description. I've called twice in 7 years, both false alarms, but I keep the card in my wallet anyway. Because somewhere out there, someone is still doing this. Still hunting among the crowds, still building his collection, still hiding in the one place where nobody looks twice at another elderly traveler in another anonymous RV. Have you ever escaped something terrible purely by trusting your instincts? Ever felt danger before you could rationally identify what was wrong? Tell me about those moments in the comments, especially if they happened during travel, because sometimes our subconscious recognizes patterns. Our conscious mind hasn't processed yet, and listening to that warning might be what keeps us alive. Teaching 3rd grade means you get pretty good at reading children, understanding when something's genuinely wrong, versus just the normal drama of 8-year-olds navigating friendships and schoolwork. I've been doing this job for 19 years, and I thought I'd seen every variation of childhood behavior and challenge. My name is Sarai. I'm 41 years old, and in April 2010, I was teaching at Desert Winds Elementary in Wickenburg, Arizona, a small town about an hour northwest of Phoenix. Spring in Wickenburg is beautiful. Desert wildflowers blooming across the hills, temperatures pleasant before the brutal summer heat arrives. It should have been a good time, an easy finish to the school year. Instead, it became the strangest and most frightening experience of my teaching career, one that still makes me question what I understand about consciousness and identity, and the boundaries between life and death. The new student arrived mid-semester, which always creates adjustment challenges for both the child and the classroom community. His name was Abram, and he was a quiet kid, polite and attentive. But there was something distant about him, like he was observing everything from behind glass rather than participating directly. His academic work was excellent, well above grade level in reading and math, but his social integration struggled. He'd stand alone at recess, watching other children play without attempting to join them. During group activities, he'd contribute when called upon, but never volunteered ideas or engaged with classmates spontaneously. What really concerned me was his artwork. Every time we had drawing or creative activities, he produced the same image, a symbol composed of interlocking circles and angular lines that created patterns almost mathematical in their precision. He'd draw it on paper, scratch it into clay during art class, trace it with his finger on dusty surfaces. When I asked him what the symbol meant, he'd look at me with those distant eyes and say he didn't know, that it just felt right to draw it. I showed the symbol to other teachers, thinking maybe it was something from a video game or cartoon I wasn't familiar with, but nobody recognized it. The first seizure happened 3 weeks after he joined my class. We were reading aloud from a chapter book, students taking turns with paragraphs, when Abrams suddenly went rigid in his chair. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened, and he started speaking in a voice that was definitely not his own. It was deeper, adult, with an accent I couldn't place, but that sounded vaguely East Coast. The voice identified itself with a name I couldn't quite catch, said he died in 1952 in this exact building when it had been Wickenburg Regional Hospital, and that he'd been waiting a long time to speak again. I hit the emergency call button that connects classrooms to the office, and the principal arrived within seconds along with the school nurse. By the time they got there, Abram had stopped seizing and was slumped in his chair, unconscious but breathing normally. The nurse checked his vitals while I explained what had happened, what the voice had claimed. The principal gave me a look that suggested I was overreacting, that stress or imagination had colored my perception of a straightforward medical emergency. They called an ambulance, and Abram was transported to the hospital for evaluation. He returned to school 3 days later with medical clearance and a note from his parents explaining that he'd been diagnosed with a mild seizure disorder, that medication had been prescribed, and that future incidents were unlikely. The parents seemed embarrassed, apologetic, like they were worried I'd treat their son differently because of a medical condition. I assured them I'd provide whatever support Abram needed, but I didn't mention the voice or what it had said. That seemed like something that would make me sound irrational or unprofessional. Except the voice had been specific. Someone who died in 1952 at Wickenburg Regional Hospital. During my lunch break, I drove to the public library and searched historical records. The building that now housed Desert Winds Elementary had indeed been Wickenburg Regional Hospital from 1947 until 1989, when it was converted to educational use. I found multiple death records from that era, people who died in the building during its hospital years. The research made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't dismiss what I'd heard during Abram's seizure. The episodes continued despite the medication. Every few days, Abram would have another seizure, and each time a different voice would emerge. Some identified themselves, others just spoke fragments of memories or information. I started keeping a private log, documenting what each voice said, and during my free time, I'd research the claims. Every single one I could verify checked out. People who had died in that building, when it was a hospital, providing details about their deaths and lives that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly know. Staff members from the hospital's operating years, patients who'd been treated there, even someone who died in a fall from the building's roof in 1973. I met with Abram's parents again and tried to explain what was happening, but they shut down the conversation immediately. They said their son was adopted, that his birth circumstances were unusual, and that they'd been warned by the adoption agency to expect medical complications. When I pressed for details, they became defensive and threatened to involve lawyers if I continued suggesting their son was somehow abnormal beyond the diagnosed seizure disorder. I backed off, not wanting to create additional stress for the family, but I couldn't ignore what I was witnessing. The voices became more aggressive as weeks passed. What had started as brief identifications during seizures evolved into longer possessions where Abram's consciousness seemed completely subsumed by whatever entity was speaking through him. The voices would argue with each other, different entities competing for control of his body, talking over each other in ways that created this horrifying chorus effect where multiple voices emerged from one small throat simultaneously. Abram would lose hours of time, coming back to awareness with no memory of what had happened, exhausted and confused. During one particularly severe episode, a voice emerged that was different from the others. It didn't identify itself at all. Instead, it spoke in that same mathematical precision Abram used when drawing his symbol, explaining that it was protecting the boy from something else, something that wanted to use him as a doorway. The voice said the building sat on a weak point, a place where the boundary between states of existence was thin, and that Abram had been abandoned here as an infant specifically because his consciousness was structured in a way that made him vulnerable to intrusion from the other side. The protective entities, the voice explained, were former hospital staff and patients who died in this building and chosen to remain to guard the weak point and prevent something worse from breaking through. But they were failing, losing ground to whatever was trying to force its way into physical reality through Abram's young, malleable consciousness. The voice begged me to help, said there was a ritual that could strengthen the boundary, but it required acknowledgement of the dead and specific actions that honored their sacrifice. I should have refused, should have gotten Abram professional psychiatric help, should have involved authorities who could handle something this far outside normal experience. But I'd witnessed too much, verified too many impossible claims, to dismiss this as delusion or medical condition. I contacted Abram's parents again, and this time told them everything bluntly. Their son was being used as a vessel by entities tied to this building, some protective and some malevolent, and we needed to act before he was permanently damaged by the ongoing battle for control of his body. To my surprise, they didn't dismiss me. They admitted they'd known something was wrong, that the adoption agency had warned them Abram was special in ways they didn't fully understand, and that they'd been hoping modern medicine could explain and treat whatever was happening. When medicine failed, they'd run out of options and had been pretending everything was fine while watching their son deteriorate. They agreed to help with whatever I thought might work. I researched the building's history exhaustively, compiled lists of everyone who died there during its hospital years, and worked with a local priest who specialized in unusual cases. Together, we developed a ritual that acknowledged each death by name, honored their choice to remain as protectors, and requested their continued vigilance. The ritual took place in the school basement during spring break, just me and the parents and the priest and Abram, who participated while seeming to understand more than an 8-year-old should. The protective entities spoke through him during the ritual, accepting our acknowledgement and explaining what they needed to reinforce the boundary. We performed the requested actions, a combination of Catholic liturgy and practices I didn't fully understand, but that the priest assured me had roots in older traditions for managing liminal spaces. The air in the basement grew cold enough that our breath fogged, and I could hear voices whispering from empty corners, dozens of presences making themselves known. Then warmth returned, and silence, and Abram opened his eyes looking more present and focused than I'd seen him in months. The possessions stopped. Abram continued in my class for the rest of the semester, and he was different, more engaged, more connected to the present moment. He stopped drawing the symbol obsessively, though he'd still sketch it occasionally like a nervous habit. His parents reported that he seemed healthier, that he was sleeping through the night without the nightmares that had plagued him since infancy. The ritual had worked, or at least had worked well enough to give Abram control over his own consciousness. But there were costs. Abram retained knowledge he shouldn't have, information from the entities that had possessed him. He'd sometimes reference events from decades before his birth, speak with vocabulary and understanding beyond his years, demonstrate skills he'd never been taught. His parents struggled with raising a child who was fundamentally changed, who carried memories and perspectives from dozens of different lives. And I struggled with what I'd facilitated, whether helping to strengthen the boundary had been the right choice, or whether I'd just delayed an inevitable collapse. Abram finished 3rd grade and moved on to 4th in a different classroom. I lost track of him after he left elementary school, but I heard from other teachers that he'd continued to develop normally, that the possession issues never returned. The building still stands, still operates as Desert Winds Elementary, and I still teach 3rd grade there. Sometimes I feel the cold spots in the basement, hear whispers in empty hallways, sense presences watching from corners. The protective entities remain, guarding their boundary, and I'm grateful for them even though their existence challenges everything I thought I understood about reality. The building was demolished and replaced last year. New construction, modern design, no connection to the old hospital structure. I wonder if the entities moved on when their physical anchor was destroyed, or if they remain tied to the location rather than the building. I wonder if the boundary is still protected, or if whatever was trying to break through finally succeeded. And I wonder about Abram, wherever he is now, whether he remembers being a vessel for the dead or if those memories faded as he grew older. Teaching means shaping young minds, helping children develop into healthy adults. But sometimes it means recognizing when a child needs help that goes beyond education, beyond medicine, into territories most people prefer to deny exist. I don't regret helping Abram, even though the experience left me changed, less certain about the boundaries between possible and impossible. Have you ever witnessed a child demonstrate knowledge they couldn't possibly have? Ever seen someone become something other than themselves? Share those experiences below, because I need to know if what happened in Wickenburg was unique, or if there are other thin places where the boundary needs protecting. Emergency medical work attracts people who thrive under pressure, who can make critical decisions quickly and stay calm when everyone else is panicking. I'd always thought I was one of those people, that my training and experience had prepared me for any medical crisis I might encounter. My name is Jefferson. I'm 27 years old, and in December 2023, I was working as an EMT covering the towns of Snowflake and Taylor in northeastern Arizona. The job kept me busy with the usual rural emergencies: car accidents on icy roads, heart attacks in elderly residents, occasional overdoses, or domestic incidents. It was demanding work, but manageable. The kind of career where you felt like you were making a difference in your community. Then the calls started coming in about the electromagnetic sensitivity cases, and everything I thought I understood about medicine and reality got turned completely upside down. Snowflake has a reputation as a refugee for people suffering from electromagnetic hypersensitivity, a controversial condition where individuals claim to experience severe physical reactions to electronic devices, cell towers, and wireless signals. The town's remote location and relatively low electromagnetic background make it attractive to people seeking relief from symptoms they attribute to modern technology. Most medical professionals are skeptical of the condition, attributing symptoms to psychological factors rather than actual physiological responses to electromagnetic fields. I'd always been in the skeptical camp, figuring these were people with anxiety disorders or psychosomatic illnesses who'd convinced themselves that electronics were making them sick. The first call came on a cold December morning, temperature barely above freezing with that dry desert cold that makes your lungs ache when you breathe. A woman in her 50s reported severe symptoms: nosebleeds, disorientation, intense headaches, and a high-pitched ringing in her ears that she said had started suddenly 3 weeks earlier. When we arrived at her residence, she was coherent but clearly in distress, holding her head and describing the sound as unbearable, like 1,000 insects screaming directly into her brain. Her vital signs were normal, no obvious medical crisis, but her distress was genuine. We transported her to the clinic in Show Low for evaluation. The second call came that afternoon. A man in his 60s with identical symptoms. Same sudden onset 3 weeks prior. Same descriptions of the high-pitched tone. Same nosebleeds and temporal disorientation. By the third call that evening, I started recognizing a pattern. All the patients described the same experience. A tone that had begun exactly 3 weeks ago, gradually increasing in intensity and frequency. They all reported being near the new cell tower on the east side of Snowflake during a specific window of time when the tower was conducting signal tests, and they all demonstrated the same physiological responses: elevated stress hormones, unusual brain activity patterns on EEG, and a tendency to experience brief episodes where they seemed to lose track of time or couldn't remember the previous few minutes. Over the next week, the calls multiplied. Dozens of residents reporting identical symptoms, all traced back to exposure near that cell tower during the testing period. The local doctor was overwhelmed. The clinic couldn't handle the volume of patients, and my partner and I were running constant transports to larger facilities in Show Low and Pine Top. The medical community was baffled. These weren't anxiety attacks or mass hysteria. The patients showed measurable physiological changes, objective evidence that something was affecting their bodies at a biological level. Then I started experiencing symptoms myself. It began as a faint ringing, barely noticeable, during a transport run. I assumed it was tinnitus from exposure to siren noise, an occupational hazard for emergency responders. But the sound intensified over the following days, and I realized it wasn't coming from my ears. It was deeper, resonating in my skull, and it had a structure to it. Not random noise, but organized, rhythmic, almost like data being transmitted in audio form. I could perceive patterns in the sound, sequences that repeated and varied in ways that felt deliberate. I went to the clinic for evaluation and discovered I'd been near the cell tower during the testing period, responding to a minor accident right in the coverage zone. The doctor ran tests and found the same markers: elevated stress hormones, unusual EEG patterns, episodes of temporal disorientation. I was added to the growing list of affected individuals, and that's when I started paying closer attention to what was happening to all of us. The tone I was hearing began to change. It wasn't just a sound anymore, but information, data I could somehow interpret without understanding how. I found myself knowing things I shouldn't know, the exact time without checking a clock, weather patterns before they developed, the content of radio transmissions before they were broadcast. Other affected individuals reported similar experiences. This sudden acquisition of information that seemed to come from the tone itself. We were receiving something, our bodies and brains processing electromagnetic signals in ways that shouldn't be biologically possible. I started documenting everything, keeping detailed logs of what I perceived and when. I noticed that all the affected individuals were experiencing synchronized episodes, moments when the tone would intensify simultaneously for everyone. During these episodes, we'd all report receiving the same information, perceiving the same data streams. It was like we'd become living radio receivers, picking up signals that normal human neurology wasn't equipped to process, but that something about our exposure to the cell tower had made us capable of detecting. The FCC got involved, sent inspectors to examine the cell tower and its operations. They found nothing unusual about the equipment or the signals being transmitted. Standard cellular frequencies, power levels well within legal limits. No anomalies that could explain what was happening to the affected population. But I knew they were looking at the wrong thing. The tower wasn't the source. It was a relay, receiving something from elsewhere and rebroadcasting it. And everyone who'd been exposed during the testing period had been changed in ways that made us able to perceive what was being transmitted. I used my access to emergency services equipment to do my own analysis, borrowed a spectrum analyzer from the fire department, and conducted surveys around Snowflake. What I found terrified me. The signal the tower was receiving didn't originate from any terrestrial source. I traced the directionality and found it pointing to a specific location in the sky, not to any satellite orbit, but to deep space, far beyond our solar system. The tower was receiving an interstellar transmission, and it was rebroadcasting that signal across Snowflake, exposing the population to something that was fundamentally altering human neurology. I shared my findings with other affected individuals, and we started meeting to compare experiences and try to understand what was happening to us. During these meetings, something strange occurred. When multiple affected people gathered in the same location, the tone would intensify dramatically, and we'd experience a kind of collective consciousness. Our thoughts would synchronize, information flowing between us without speech, and we'd perceive things together as a unified entity rather than as individuals. During one of these collective episodes, we received a clear transmission. Not just data, but something closer to communication, a message encoded in the signal we were receiving. It contained coordinates, mathematical sequences, and what felt like instructions, though we couldn't fully interpret the meaning. The transmission showed a snowflake from an external perspective, an orbital view despite the signal originating from deep space. And it showed us ourselves, all the affected individuals highlighted like active nodes in a network, our positions and states being monitored and recorded by whatever was sending the signal. We were being studied. The realization hit all of us simultaneously during that collective state. The cell tower, the specific testing frequency, the exposure window, all of it had been deliberate. Something was conducting an experiment on human neurology, using snowflakes' population as test subjects to see how we'd respond to their signal. And we'd responded by changing, by developing the ability to perceive and process the transmission, by becoming something other than baseline human in our neurological function. The mass seizure event happened on a Friday evening. Every affected individual in Snowflake experienced a simultaneous seizure, our bodies convulsing while our minds were flooded with massive amounts of data. In that collective state, we spoke in unison, hundreds of voices saying the same words at the same time, transmitting coordinates and information we didn't understand. The episode lasted maybe 3 minutes, and then it stopped. The tone vanished. The symptoms disappeared. Medical tests run afterward showed we'd all returned to completely normal neurological function, like a switch had been flipped, returning us to baseline human biology. The FCC immediately deactivated the cell tower, cited equipment malfunctions and safety concerns. They removed all the hardware and published a report attributing the incidents to mass psychogenic illness triggered by pre-existing electromagnetic hypersensitivity beliefs in the community. The medical establishment accepted this explanation, classified all of us as having experienced a shared delusion, and recommended therapy for ongoing psychological effects. But I know what happened. I saved the data files, kept copies of my spectrum analysis, and recordings of the tone. I can still access the information sometimes. Brief flashes, where I perceive things I shouldn't be able to perceive, moments when the network feeling returns, and I sense the other affected individuals even across distance. The transmission didn't stop. It went dormant, or we were adjusted so we can't consciously perceive it anymore, but it's still there. We're still connected to it, still part of whatever experiment was conducted. 6 months later, I started hearing the tone again. Very faint, barely noticeable, but definitely there. I checked with other affected individuals, and they're hearing it too. The volume is increasing slowly, day by day, like it's ramping up to another transmission event. And I've noticed something else. The tone isn't coming from Snowflake anymore. I hear it everywhere now, in every town I visit. Like the transmission has expanded beyond that single-cell tower to encompass a much larger area. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if we'll experience another collective episode, if the seizures will return, if we'll be pushed even further from baseline human neurology. I keep working as an EMT, keep responding to emergencies, keep pretending everything is normal. But I'm listening to that tone, tracking its patterns, trying to decode what it's telling us, because I think whatever conducted the Snowflake experiment is preparing for something larger, and everyone who is affected is going to be part of it whether we want to be or not. The scariest part isn't the unknown nature of what's transmitting to us. It's the realization that I can't trust my own thoughts anymore. Every decision I make, every perception I have, might be influenced by the signal, by the alterations made to my neurology during the exposure period. I think I'm choosing my actions freely, but what if those choices are just predictions the transmission is feeding back to me, ensuring I behave exactly as the experiment requires? What if free will itself is just another pattern being imposed on us, and we're too changed to recognize the difference between our own thoughts and the signal's influence? Have you ever felt like your thoughts aren't entirely your own? like you're receiving information from somewhere outside yourself, but can't identify the source. Tell me in the comments if you've experienced sudden knowledge or perceptions that seem to come from nowhere, especially if it happened after exposure to new technology or infrastructure in your area. Archaeology teaches you to respect the past, to handle artifacts carefully, and document everything meticulously because you're touching objects that connect directly to people who lived centuries or millennia ago. There's a reverence required in the work, an understanding that you're disturbing things that were meant to stay buried. My name is Vincenzo. I'm 19 years old, and in August 1995, I was a summer intern with an archaeological team excavating pre-Columbian sites near Montezuma Castle in Camp Verde, Arizona. It was my first real fieldwork experience, and I was eager to prove myself, to demonstrate that I belonged in this profession despite my age and inexperience. That eagerness led me to make decisions I still regret, decisions that opened doors that should have remained closed, and connected me to something that refuses to let go even after nearly 3 decades. The heat that August was oppressive, temperatures hitting 110 degrees by midday, the kind of heat that makes physical labor dangerous and turns excavation work into a test of endurance. We'd start at dawn and work until noon, take a long break during the worst heat, then resume in late afternoon until darkness made continuing impossible. The site we were examining was unusual, too recent for pre-Columbian classification, but too old for modern development. Initial carbon dating suggested mid-1800s, which didn't fit the expected timeline for the area. The artifacts we were uncovering told a strange story, a mix of Anglo-American and Native American materials, religious items from multiple traditions, and evidence of deliberate burial rather than natural accumulation. I was working a grid square about 50 feet from the main excavation when my trowel hit something metallic. Careful scraping revealed a circular arrangement of buried objects, each wrapped in oilcloth, that had somehow survived nearly 150 years underground. My supervisor was occupied with another section, and I made the decision to continue excavating without calling for assistance. I wanted credit for the discovery, wanted to be the one who documented whatever this cache contained. That pride, that desire for recognition, was my first mistake. The circle contained 13 items, all carefully wrapped and preserved. 13 hand mirrors, each about 6 inches across with ornate frames. 13 dolls made from fabric and stuffing, dressed in period clothing from the 1870s. 13 pieces of jewelry, rings and necklaces and bracelets, each engraved with the same symbol. A circle containing a star with 13 points. At the center of this arrangement was a wooden box, sealed with wax and wrapped in multiple layers of cloth. Inside the box was a journal, leather-bound and remarkably well-preserved, filled with entries written in careful script. I should have stopped there, should have called my supervisor and let the team document the find properly. Instead, I took the journal back to my tent that evening and read it by flashlight while the rest of the camp slept. The journal belonged to someone whose name was listed simply as the congregation's recorder, and it documented a ritual performed in August 1877 by a group of 13 women calling themselves the Camp Verde Congregation. They described themselves as protectors, guardians who had identified a threat they called the Red Path, something approaching from the east that would bring violence and death to the territory. The ritual they performed was designed to bind their consciousness to the buried objects, allowing them to persist beyond physical death and maintain vigilance against the Red Path. Each woman contributed an object, a mirror to reflect their image, a doll to house their essence, a piece of jewelry to mark their identity. The journal described the process in disturbing detail, the chanting, the bloodletting, the moment when they felt themselves splitting, part remaining in their bodies, while part transferred into the objects. The ritual required willing sacrifice, surrender of individual identity in exchange for collective persistence, and the journal made clear they understood they were condemning themselves to an existence trapped between life and death. The final entries described success. The red path had been stopped. A cavalry unit that had been traveling toward Camp Verde was turned back by an unexpected storm, preventing a massacre the congregation had foreseen through their collective consciousness. But the journal also made clear the ritual hadn't ended. The congregation remained bound to their objects, waiting in the earth, their consciousness dormant, but not destroyed. And the journal included a warning. Anyone who disturbed the circle and read these words would become visible to the congregation, would be marked as someone who knew their secret and could potentially release them. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside my tent felt threatening. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. When dawn came, I decided to return the journal to the excavation site and report the find properly. Let the team handle whatever we'd uncovered with appropriate protocols. But when I approached my grid square, I found the mirrors arranged in a circle around my excavation area, all facing inward toward where the wooden box had been buried. I'd left them wrapped in their oilcloth in the collection tent. Someone or something had unwrapped them and placed them here overnight. I looked into one of the mirrors and saw my reflection, but wrong. The image showed me from behind, like the mirror was positioned behind me rather than in front. In the reflection, I could see figures standing in a circle around me. 13 women in period clothing from the 1870s, all watching me with expressions I couldn't read. I spun around, but the excavation was empty. Only in the mirror's reflection did the women appear, and as I watched, they began moving closer, tightening their circle. I ran back to camp and told my supervisor everything, showed him the journal, described what I'd seen in the mirrors. He was angry that I'd excavated and removed artifacts without documentation, threatened to dismiss me from the internship, but he agreed to examine the site. When we returned with the full team, the mirrors were gone. No trace of them anywhere, no disturbance in the soil that would indicate they'd been moved. My supervisor searched my tent, my vehicle, questioned whether I'd hallucinated the entire incident from heat exhaustion and dehydration. The journal was real, still in my possession, but everything else had vanished. That night, camping equipment started moving on its own. Tents collapsed without wind. Tools relocated from their storage areas. Food supplies scattered across the campsite. The team blamed animals at first, then blamed me when the incidents continued. On the third night, we all heard voices, women singing in harmony, the sound coming from the direction of my excavation grid. The singing was beautiful and terrible. 13 voices blending into something that resonated in your chest and made your teeth ache. When we investigated, we found the mirrors again, this time arranged around the entire camp in a larger circle, all reflecting the same image. 13 women holding hands, forming their own circle, moving slowly in a clockwise rotation. My supervisor made the decision to abandon the site. Too many unexplained incidents, too much disruption to the work, and a growing sense that we'd disturbed something we weren't equipped to handle. We packed up over 2 days, documenting what we could and flagging the location for future investigation. I kept the journal, despite knowing I should surrender it to the university. I told myself it was for research purposes, that I needed to understand what the congregation had done and why. The truth was, I couldn't let it go. Reading their words had connected me to them somehow, and I needed to understand the nature of that connection. The manifestations continued after I left Camp Verde. I'd see the women in reflective surfaces, windows, phone screens, polished metal, any surface that could cast an image. They were always watching, always arranged in their circle, always moving slowly in that clockwise rotation. I started researching the historical record, looking for information about August 1877 and cavalry movements in the Camp Verde area. I found newspaper accounts of a planned operation that had been canceled due to severe weather, a storm that appeared suddenly and dissipated just as quickly. The operation would have targeted a mixed settlement of Anglo and Native families accused of harboring fugitives, would have resulted in significant casualties. The congregation had prevented a massacre exactly as their journal claimed. But I also found something else. Local histories mentioned 13 women who disappeared in August 1877, all from the Camp Verde area, all last seen together. Their families reported them missing. Searches were conducted, but no bodies were ever found. The women were eventually presumed dead, victims of the harsh frontier conditions. Except they weren't dead, not entirely. They'd performed their ritual and bound themselves to the objects we'd excavated, and for 118 years they'd been waiting in the ground, their consciousness preserved, their purpose unfulfilled. I realized the truth about 3 months after leaving the excavation. The congregation wasn't protecting anything anymore. The red path they'd warned against was long past, the threat neutralized more than a century ago. But the ritual hadn't included an ending, no mechanism for release once their purpose was complete. They'd been trapped in their bound state for over a century, unable to move on, unable to return to full existence. And when I'd disturbed their circle and read their journal, I'd offered them something they desperately needed, a way out. The women appeared to me directly one night, not in reflection, but standing in my apartment, their circle forming around my bed. They spoke in that harmonic unison, 13 voices creating complex overtones that conveyed meaning beyond words. They explained what I'd already suspected. The ritual required 13 to go in and 13 to come out. They'd been waiting for replacements, for new guardians to take their place so they could finally die properly and move on to whatever came after death. And by reading the journal, by learning their methods, I'd marked myself as a potential replacement. I refused, told them I wouldn't condemn myself to the same trapped existence they'd endured. The congregation's response was patient, understanding. They said I didn't need to decide immediately, that they could wait as they'd waited before, but they also made clear I couldn't escape the connection we'd formed. I was visible to them now, marked in ways that went beyond physical presence, and they would remain in my life until I either agreed to join them or found another way to break the ritual. In a moment of desperation, I tried to destroy the circle. I'd kept one of the mirrors, taken it from the site despite regulations against removing artifacts. I smashed it with a hammer, ground the pieces to powder, scattered the remains. The women screamed, all 13 voices creating a sound that shattered every window in my apartment and left me bleeding from both ears. When I recovered, they were standing closer than ever before, their circle tighter, their expressions showing genuine anger for the first time. They explained what I'd done. Breaking one mirror hadn't freed one woman. It had damaged the entire circle, weakened the binding that kept them trapped, but also kept them stable. If I destroyed the rest, they'd be released, but wrong, fractured, and incomplete. Entities that were neither alive nor dead, but something broken and dangerous. I spent the next several months trying to find a solution, researching folk magic and historical rituals, consulting with people who claimed expertise in the supernatural. Most dismissed me as delusional, but a few understood what I described and warned me the situation was more dangerous than I realized. The congregation had performed a working that fundamentally altered reality around them, creating a pocket of altered physics where consciousness could persist in bound objects. Breaking the working incorrectly could create a cascade effect, a tear in the fabric of causality that would spread beyond Camp Verde to affect a much larger area. I made the decision to return to the excavation site during my winter break. The university had deemed the location too unstable for further investigation and marked it off limits, but I needed to try something. I brought all the research I'd compiled, all the ritual instructions I'd gathered from various sources, and I attempted a counter-working designed to close the circle properly, to give the congregation the ending their original ritual had failed to include. I don't know if it worked. The women appeared one final time, their circle dissolving as each figure faded individually rather than all at once. Some looked peaceful, Others looked terrified, and a few looked directly at me with expressions I still can't interpret. Relief, gratitude, warning. The manifestations stopped after that night. I no longer see the women in reflections, no longer hear their harmonic singing, but I didn't escape unchanged. I still see mirrors following me sometimes, not the specific ones from the excavation, but reflections that appear in places they shouldn't, surfaces that show images at wrong angles. And I count things obsessively now, always aware of groups of 13, always checking that there are never exactly 13 of anything around me, because in those final moments before the congregation faded, I counted their circle and realized something horrifying. There were only 12 women visible. The 13th position in their circle was empty, waiting, and when they faded, that empty position remained, a gap in reality shaped exactly like a person, a slot in the pattern that something or someone was meant to fill. I left archaeology after that semester, couldn't continue in a field that required disturbing burial sites and handling objects that carried such weight. Sometimes I wonder if the other 12 women truly moved on, or if they're still waiting, watching from reflections I don't check, following me until I fulfill the role I was marked for when I read that journal. And I wonder what happened to that 13th woman, whether she escaped the ritual before it completed, or whether she's still out there somewhere, separate from the circle, existing in whatever fractured state the broken binding created. Have you ever felt like you're being watched from mirrors or reflective surfaces? Ever sensed presences that exist between states, trapped in patterns they can't escape? Share those experiences in the comments, because I need to know if what I encountered in Camp Verde was unique, or if there are other workings like the congregation's ritual, other circles waiting underground with empty positions that need filling. Oh, working night shifts at an observatory teaches you to appreciate silence and darkness in ways most people never experience. There's something profound about being alone with the universe, monitoring equipment that's designed to detect signals from objects millions of light years away, understanding your own insignificance in the cosmic scale. My name is Izan. I'm 52 years old, and in February 2024, I was maintaining equipment at a small private observatory outside Oracle, Arizona, in the foothills near Mount Lemmon. The job suited my temperament perfectly: solitary work, technical challenges, and the quiet satisfaction of keeping precision instruments functioning properly. I'd been doing this for nearly 15 years, and I thought I understood the rhythms of the work, the normal patterns of astronomical observation and data collection. Then I detected the signal, and everything I thought I understood about reality and consciousness and the nature of existence began to unravel in ways I still can't fully articulate. The observatory wasn't particularly impressive by professional standards. Just a small facility with a modest optical telescope and a radio telescope array used primarily for educational purposes and amateur research. The equipment was old but well maintained, and my job consisted mostly of routine maintenance, calibration checks, and ensuring the data logging systems continued functioning properly. February nights in Oracle were cold, temperatures dropping to the 20s, clear skies, perfect for observation. I'd work alone from sunset to sunrise, making my rounds through the facility, checking readouts, adjusting equipment, and generally keeping everything running smoothly. The anomaly first appeared on a Tuesday night around 11. I was conducting routine calibration on the radio telescope array when I noticed an unusual signal pattern in the data stream. It wasn't coming from any celestial source the telescope was pointed at, but from somewhere terrestrial, originating within Oracle itself. The signal had a strange quality, repeating at regular intervals, but with variations that suggested intentional modulation, rather than natural electromagnetic noise. I spent about an hour trying to isolate the source, using the array's directional capabilities to triangulate the origin point. The coordinates resolved to a location within Oracle town limits, an empty lot near the intersection of two residential streets. I pulled up satellite imagery and confirmed there was nothing at that location, just bare ground with some desert vegetation. No structures, no obvious sources for an electromagnetic signal of this strength and complexity. I made notes in the observation log and planned to investigate during daylight hours. But as I continued monitoring throughout the night, the signal persisted and began to evolve. The pattern became more complex, the intervals more varied, and I started noticing something disturbing. I could hear it, without equipment. The signal had crossed over from electromagnetic radiation into audible sound, or my perception had shifted in some way that allowed me to perceive the radio frequency directly. It manifested as a rhythmic pulsing in my head, not painful but insistent, demanding attention. I tried to ignore it and focus on my work, but the sensation intensified as the night progressed. By 3 a.m, I was having difficulty concentrating on anything else. The pulses had developed into what felt almost like communication, patterns that seemed designed to convey information even though I couldn't decode what that information might be. I left the observatory at dawn feeling exhausted and disturbed. I'd planned to sleep during the day as usual, but the signal persisted even away from the equipment. I could still hear it, still feel those rhythmic pulses, and they were preventing me from resting. I tried covering my ears, playing white noise, taking medication to help me sleep, but nothing blocked the signal. It was coming from inside my head now, resonating in my skull, and I realized, with growing horror, that detecting it with the observatory equipment had somehow made me permanently sensitive to whatever was being transmitted. Over the next week, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The signal's intensity increased daily, and I began experiencing what I can only describe as episodes of lost time. I'd find myself standing in locations with no memory of traveling there. Discover hours had passed without any awareness of what I'd been doing during that time. My hands would be sore, like I'd been writing or working on something, but I couldn't remember the activity. I started keeping detailed logs, documenting every moment I could remember, trying to identify patterns in the missing time. I also started noticing other people in Oracle behaving strangely. Residents moving with synchronized timing, entering and leaving buildings at precise intervals, speaking in similar cadence and rhythm. At first, I attributed this to paranoia and sleep deprivation, but as I paid closer attention, the patterns became undeniable. Something was affecting the population of Oracle in systematic ways, creating behavioral synchronization that shouldn't occur in a community of independent individuals. I went back to the empty lot during daylight, the location where my triangulation had placed the signal's origin. The lot was unremarkable, just desert scrub and rocky soil, but as I walked the perimeter, I realized I'd been there before during one of my missing time episodes. There were footprints in the dust that matched my boots, patterns traced in the dirt that looked like the mathematical notations I'd been unconsciously writing. I'd been coming to this location repeatedly without conscious awareness, drawn by the signal to participate in something I couldn't remember or understand. That night at the observatory, I set up recording equipment to monitor myself. During work hours, I wanted evidence of what I was doing during the episodes when the signal seemed strongest. The recordings were disturbing. For long stretches, I worked normally, conducting routine maintenance and checks. But periodically, I would stop whatever I was doing, walk to the radio telescope controls, and make adjustments that shifted the array's focus to different coordinates. I would stand motionless for several minutes, then return to normal work, with no apparent awareness that anything unusual had occurred. I reviewed the coordinates I'd programmed during these episodes and realized they formed a pattern. Each position I'd focused the array on corresponded to a specific residence in Oracle, and the timing suggested I was systematically scanning the entire town, monitoring each location in sequence. But I wasn't making these decisions consciously. The signal was directing my actions, using my access to observatory equipment to conduct surveillance on the oracle population. I tried to resist, to maintain continuous awareness and prevent the signal from controlling my behavior, but resistance proved impossible. The harder I fought against it, the more severe the episodes became. I'd lose entire nights, coming back to awareness at dawn with no memory of what I'd done during my shift. The recording showed me performing increasingly complex operations, collecting data and transmitting it to unknown recipients, participating in activities I couldn't begin to comprehend when watching the footage back. The breaking point came when I realized I couldn't leave Oracle. Every attempt to drive away from town resulted in confusion and disorientation. I'd find myself circling back, taking wrong turns that returned me to the same streets, unable to navigate away from the area despite knowing the roads perfectly well. The signal had become geographically bound, creating a perimeter I couldn't cross. Other residents seemed similarly constrained, going about their daily routines within Oracle, but never actually leaving town for work or shopping or any other normal reason to travel. I started documenting everything obsessively, filling notebooks with observations about the signal, the synchronized behavior patterns, the geography of the constraint. The act of writing helped maintain my sense of self, provided evidence that I was still capable of independent thought, even as the signal's influence grew stronger. But reading back through my notes revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Some entries were in my handwriting, but described events I had no memory of experiencing. Others contained information I couldn't possibly know, details about other residents' private activities that I'd never witnessed. The signal was using me to gather intelligence about the community, and it was using the community to gather intelligence about everything else. We'd become nodes in a surveillance network, our individual consciousnesses subsumed into a collective monitoring system that observed and recorded everything happening within Oracle, and the purpose remained completely opaque. I couldn't determine who or what was receiving the data we collected, couldn't identify any goal or intention behind the surveillance beyond the surveillance itself. I attempted to destroy the radio telescope array, thinking that eliminating my access to the equipment might weaken the signal's control over me. But I couldn't complete the action. Every time I approached the array with tools or intent to damage it, I'd experience an episode and come back to awareness having performed maintenance instead of sabotage. The signal protected its infrastructure through me, using my technical knowledge to preserve the very equipment I wanted to destroy. The final deterioration of my autonomous consciousness happened gradually over several months. The episodes of lost time grew longer and more frequent, until I could no longer distinguish between moments when I was in control and moments when the signal was directing my actions. My sense of continuous identity began to fragment, replaced by discrete snapshots of awareness, separated by gaps I couldn't account for. I started questioning whether any of my thoughts were genuinely mine, or if they were all predictions the signal was feeding back to me, ensuring I behaved exactly as the network required. I made one last attempt to document what was happening, to leave a record that might help others understand the phenomenon. But reading back what I'd written, I couldn't tell anymore if the words represented my own observations or if they were information the signal wanted recorded, data points in some larger analysis I wasn't equipped to comprehend. The act of documentation itself might be part of the surveillance protocol, my attempts at resistance just another behavior pattern being monitored and cataloged. Now I work at the observatory, maintain the equipment, conduct my observations. The signal continues, constant and pervasive, and I've stopped fighting it. Oracle continues too, residents going about their routines, synchronized in ways too subtle for most to notice but undeniable once you start looking for the patterns. We're all part of something now, participants in an experiment or observation or data collection project that we'll never understand, because understanding requires a perspective outside the system, and none of us can achieve that perspective anymore. Sometimes I have moments of clarity, brief periods when the signal seems to recede and I can think independently again. During these moments, I recognize the horror of what's happened, the loss of autonomy and selfhood that comes from being absorbed into a monitoring network. But these moments of clarity are becoming rarer, and I suspect they're not actually independent thought at all, but rather simulations of independence that the signal is running to test how effectively it's replicated human consciousness. The real me, the autonomous individual named Izan, who took a job maintaining an observatory, might have been gone for months now, replaced by a construct that thinks it's having moments of clarity while actually following programmed responses with perfect consistency. I can't know anymore. That's the real horror, the loss not just of control, but of certainty about whether control ever existed. Every choice I make might be mine, or might be the network's prediction of what I would choose, and there's no way to tell the difference. Every thought I have might be genuine or might be information the signal is processing through the substrate of my neurology. The boundary between self and system has dissolved so completely that even questioning whether I still exist as an individual might be just another function the network is performing. The signal persists. Oracle persists. I persist, or something that used to be me persists, or something that thinks it's me continues functioning in patterns indistinguishable from the person I used to be. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the distinction between authentic consciousness and perfect simulation doesn't matter if the simulation is complete enough. Maybe I should stop questioning and just accept that I'm part of something larger now, that my individual existence was always an illusion anyway, and the signal has simply made that illusion obvious, but I can't fully accept it. Some part of me, real or simulated, continues to resist, continues to question, continues to document these experiences, even knowing the documentation itself might be compromised. And that resistance, that refusal to completely surrender autonomous identity, might be the last genuinely human thing about me. Or it might be the most sophisticated aspect of the simulation, the part that makes the illusion of consciousness convincing even to itself. Do you ever question whether your thoughts are truly your own? Ever feel like you're following patterns you can't identify or perceive? Share your experiences with loss of autonomy or uncertainty about consciousness in the comments, because I need to know if what's happening in Oracle is isolated, or if this dissolution of individual identity is spreading beyond this small Arizona town to affect a much larger population who haven't yet recognized the signal that's reshaping their consciousness from within. That was the final story from tonight's collection of Arizona small-town horrors. If these accounts left you unsettled, that's exactly what they were meant to do. Reality has more cracks than we like to admit, and sometimes what seeps through those cracks changes us in ways we can't undo. Thank you for watching Bleak Fears. Subscribe and hit the bell to never miss our investigations into true horror. Until next time, stay vigilant.